Thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Retold, the show where I tell the entire Bionicle storyline from the beginning to the end. Now this is Chapter 8, the Ignition Trilogy Part 3, Rising. And this is by far the longest and most complex chapter in the entire Bionicle story. It took me almost a month to just make this video, from scripting to editing to recording, and I really do hope you enjoy. Now, there are a ton of things going on at once, because this storyline spans the entire Matoran universe, and involves basically every single named character we've seen up to this point. With three major Toa teams, you've got the Takanuva, the Toa Mari, and the Toa Haga, all fully active doing their own missions. You've got a lot of the villains. Literally every single member of the Brotherhood of Makuta has a role to play, as well as the Paraka, the Baraki. They're all still around, playing an active role in this story, and even stuff like the Visorak, they are a major threatening force as well, plus some of the other villains that we haven't seen since earlier chapters, like Rudaka, who managed to escape, Karzani, who's still imprisoned by the Order of Mananui, and so much more. Basically, if they're alive and have a name, they're probably going to be mentioned in this story and have a major role to play, which is why this video is so long. So at any point, if you're confused, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'll do my best to answer any comments that are having any questions or concerns about the exact way this is told. The way I've structured this is that I've tried to tell the story in multiple different chunks with different interludes to really try to center the story around one aspect. One of the biggest problems with the way that this story was originally told, or maybe arguably one of its strengths, was that we got bits and pieces of it one at a time, and each of these chunks were interwoven with each other, which makes it a really cool story to read, but if you put it all together, it feels very, very jumbled. So what I've tried to do is put things in somewhat chronological order, but tell stories in groups. So we've got, say, a certain chapter focusing on one team of Toa, then we go to an interlude that just focuses on another team of Toa or some other squad, and so on. And I've tried to tell the story as cohesively as possible there. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy, and let's kick off this colossal chapter of Bionicle Retold with a recap of Chapter 7, the Ignition Trilogy Part 2, Sacrifice.
In a deadly countdown to the death of the Matoran universe, the Kanohi Ignika, Mask of Life, spiraled deep beneath the black waters of the pit, forever changing the course of destiny for the Matoran dwelling in the underwater city of Mari Nui. Hunted by the exiled Baraki warlords and encountering ancient hunters brought back to life, the Toa Mari, led by Jala and Matoro, fought bravely beneath the waves. As they struggled to bring Maranui back to life, they were unexpectedly aided by the Dark Lord Makuta Pterodax, who pulled the strings of their success for his own mysterious reasons. And finally, in a tragic sacrifice to save the life of the Great Spirit robot, Matoro donned the Mask of Life, giving his own life to save the universe. And in faraway lands, the Takanuva, original team of heroes, sought to fulfill the Scroll of Preparations, an ancient document detailing a list of tasks to prepare for Mananui's revival. Along their journeys, they restored the Rahaga to their rightful forms, resurrecting the powerful Toa Haga, and ultimately gathered in Artaka to face their final destiny. This is Bionicle Retold. Chapter 8, The Ignition Trilogy, Part 3, Rising. Part 1, Siege of Karda Nui. In the darkness of the Brotherhood of Makuta's lair, factories churned and dark experiments on Karda worms brought vile shadow leeches to life, parasitic insects capable of draining all light and morality from Toa or Matoran. After delivering the Staff of Artaka to Pterodax within the pit, Makuta Icarax returned to their fortress on Destro, eager to test his new shadow leeches. Calling for his Matoran servant Voltraz, the twisted Ta Matoran with an ancient rivalry with Mazika, Icarax drained what little light was left in the devious Ta Matoran's heart, completing his first successful test of the insectoid creatures. During his missions for the Brotherhood, Voltraz discovered a secret entrance to Karda Nui, the heart of the Matoran universe, and reported his findings to the assembled Makuta. Still deep in the waters of the pit in his Maxillos form, Makuta Pterodax telepathically received the news and ordered all available Makuta to venture into the core of the universe and seize the land for the Brotherhood. And so, the gates of the Brotherhood's Destro Fortress swung open, with an army of Makuta sweeping forth, headed straight for Karda, the heart of the robot. Leading this strike force was the aggressive yet honorable Makuta Antros, general of the Brotherhood's armies and tactical commander of their legions. Wielding the Kanohi Jutlin, Mask of Corruption, Antros possessed the unique ability to break down any inorganic object with a single thought. Close behind him was the incredibly ambitious Makuta Biddle, who followed Pterodax only to gain more influence and prove his worth. Biddle wore the Kanohi Motrek, Mask of Time Duplication, which allowed him to summon past versions of himself to fight as his own personal legion. Aiding them was a fanatical Gorast, a true believer of Pterodax's plan who was willing to face death to see it carried through. With the Kanohi Felness, Mask of Disruption, Gorast had the incredible dangerous ability to disrupt any natural powers of an enemy via touch, which she could use to interfere with the Toa's innate elemental abilities. Assisting them from above was Makuta Vampra, the mute hunter who never spoke a single word, using his Kanohi Avsa, Mask of Hunger, to drain positive emotions from his target. In addition to the warriors, 2 top Brotherhood scientists were brought along to assist their research and creation of new Rahi. The first of these scientists was Makuta Chirox, infamous for creating vicious and destructive Rahi. His rival was Makuta Mutron, an eccentric, nearly insane scientist who specialized in mutations that were extremely destructive in nature. Both scientists wore copies of the Kanohi Shellek, which allowed them to deafen or mute targets. Neither scientist had respect for the other's mutations, driving a professional and personal rivalry between the two. And finally, there was Krika, the reluctant and regretful Makuta who believed that nothing good would come out of Pterodax's grand plan if it succeeded, but supported him out of fear and self-preservation. Krika wore the Kanohi Krast, Mask of Repulsion, which allowed him to repel any object away from himself at high speeds, including the ground itself, which he used to fly through the air. And as the hordes of Makuta rushed to Karda with their shadow leeches, seeking to turn the entire Matoran population to darkness, Ikarak stayed behind, tired of following Pterodax's orders and believing the attack on Karda to be a suicide mission.
Okay, so I just introduced, or at least reintroduced, many characters that really haven't gotten a lot of focus until this particular chapter. So I wanted to take this time to really address which of these are really important to follow throughout the course of this chapter, and which ones you can kind of just see as background enemies or background Makuta. So first off is Makuta Krika. So Krika is really the closest thing we have to a quote-unquote good Makuta. Again, as I mentioned, he's very reluctant to follow Pterodax's plan, and actually, he was the Makuta to free, secretly, Makuta Miserix. He spared Miserix's life, who was the original ruler of the Makuta thousands of years ago. So Krika has already kind of revolted against Pterodax in his own ways. And what's really important is that Makuta Miserix, who was the original leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta, will actually be reappearing this chapter, making some major moves. So just remember that in the past, he was kind of thrown out by Pterodax, overthrown as the ruler, but Krika spared his life and instead took him to a deserted island instead of killing him. So Miserix will be coming back in a bit. With those folks aside, basically what we have next is Makuta Antros here. Honestly, Antros is just the leader of the army, but really he doesn't have that much to do character development wise. He basically just stays steadfast as a strong leader for the Makuta. So he's the main guy you'll see in many of the fight sequences and many of the aspects where he's leading the Makuta into battle in Karda, but his character doesn't really do too much. The same goes for Vampra over here. Because Vampra is literally mute, Vampra does not speak whatsoever, there's not a lot of character stuff going on here. So you can really just see Vampra as another one of the Makuta enemies. Next up, really the only thing you need to remember about Makuta Chirox here is that she's very devoted to Makuta Pterodax's plan. She's willing to risk anything to make it happen, so just remember that about her character, and she really doesn't ever change. She's just very much a fanatic for Makuta Pterodax. Makuta Biddle here is basically just another enemy. Not really much to do character development wise, but just some other enemy for them to fight. And the two scientists that we've got here are really only important during these scientist scenes. They actually have a really fun interpersonal dynamic between them because they're very much rivals, not really respecting each other's work, and there are many scenes set within their laboratories, so when they appear, they're relevant, but again, not too much character-wise going on. You just have to know that these are the two scientists creating stuff for the Makuta, and that's why they've been brought alongside for the ride. Now, Makuta Icarax here, actually, as I mentioned, sits out most of the action, at least for the first half of this chapter. He becomes very, very important in the later halves of this chapter, where he actually kind of joins the fray and starts to embark on his own personal missions that deviate from Pterodax's main plans. But for the most part, you're not going to be seeing Icarax for a lot of the early parts of the initial Karda Nui invasion, so you can kind of just set him aside for now and just remember that Icarax chose not to go to Karda Nui because he basically believed Pterodax's plan to be crazy. And speaking of Pterodax himself, we last saw him in the Maxillos form in the Mari Nui chapter, which was last chapter, and Pterodax basically just will not appear throughout this entire chapter until the very end, because he's been setting a lot of stuff up on his own, very mysterious things going on with Pterodax, so there's kind of a big reveal near the end of the chapter. I'm not going to spoil it here, but that's why you're not actually going to see him for basically all this chapter, because Pterodax is really the guy pulling the strings behind all of these Makuta. He's the one who mysteriously sent all of the Makuta to Karda Nui. He wanted to make sure they were all there, so there's something he's planning, and you're going to find out in a little bit. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is the Matoran Voltraz here. If you recall back to chapters 1 and 2, Voltraz was one of the most evil Matoran. He murdered a ton of people and essentially murdered the mentor of the Matoran Mazika. So Mazika or Mazeka has this very strong rivalry with Voltraz and presumed him dead. So when Mazika thought he killed him, Voltraz actually was recruited by the Brotherhood of Makuta to be a Matoran spy for the Makuta. And at this point in the story, he's basically just serving Icarax, and he will actually crop up quite a lot. However, Voltraz and Mazika kind of have their own story that's completely tangential to Karda Nui. It's still pretty important, but it's not really too related to the main events, so only try to remember them or remember that they're relevant for their own particular parts of the story. They actually go explore some alternate dimensions, things get really crazy, doesn't really matter for the main Karda Nui plotline though. And with all those Makuta summed up, it's time to get back to the main story.
In a swift attack, darkness descended upon Karda Nui. The 7 Makuta blasted through the secret entrance to Karda Nui, taking the Avmatoran population by surprise and converting each village one by one to darkness with their shadow leeches. The Makuta strike force split up, one half led by Antros to infect the villages, with the other half led by Krika to descend into the swamps at the bottom of Karda Nui, blocking off any escape routes. In this decisive attack, all Avmatoran villages succumbed to darkness, save for one. And just as the final village was about to be destroyed, a colossal rumbling shook the stalactite villages of Karda Nui. The Toa Mari had just succeeded in their quest to restore Voya Nui, plugging the hole in Karda Nui's dome, and in the distance, Matoro fell along the great waterfall, completing his noble sacrifice and restarting the heart of Karda Nui. As Matoro donned the mask of life and a flash of incredible light engulfed the surroundings, the 3 Makuta who had been laying siege to the final village were struck with this outburst of light, permanently blinding them. Disoriented and enraged, Antros, Vampra, and Chirox faltered in their attack, allowing 3 Avmatoran from the final village, Tanma, Solek, and Photok, to strike back, quickly trying to gain the upper hand with their customized jetpacks and blades of light. As the battle continued, the 3 blinded Makuta called for their newly turned Shadow Matoran to merge with them, acting as their eyes via telepathy. As the battle for the final Karda Nui village raged on, the 6 Takanuva were granted the honor to set foot in the realm of Artaka. Having completed the scroll of preparations to prepare the universe for Mata Nui's awakening, the 6 original Toa were greeted by the mysterious Artaka, who had opened the gates of his fortress for the first time in millennia to welcome in the Toa. All around them, an indescribably ancient yet young voice rang out from the fortress, the rocks, the trees, and even the air itself. As Tahu listed off the completed tasks from the scroll of preparations, Artaka was pleased. Materializing from the very air in front of them were sets of strange armor, weapons, and masks. These were the adaptive armor pieces, Artaka's greatest creations. Wherever the Toa should journey, the armor would adapt to their surroundings. No terrain, no climate, no wind or wave would ever again be their master. And as the Takanuva donned their new gear, their surroundings began to morph before their eyes, teleporting the 6 heroes to the world that feeds the world, the heart of the Matoran universe, Karda Nui. When their vision finally cleared, they were in midair, high above a strange Matoran village. Somehow their armor had shifted in 100 ways, making it possible for them to stay aloft. But there was no time to wonder about that, for all around them, a battle raged in the sky. Go, Takanuva! The voice of Artaka echoed throughout this new land. Go and find your destiny at last. And so, in a blinding flash of light, the 6 Takanuva appeared on the scene. Tahu, Toa of Fire, now sprouted quadruple jetpacks and a blazing shield of fire. Gali, Toa of Water, utilized a high-powered scoped rifle complete with aerodynamic fins on her mast to soar through the sky. Liwa, Toa of Air, was truly in his element, soaring above the ground with dual jetpacks and an energy sword. Kopaka, Toa of Ice, now sported metallic wings and a laser scope on his adaptive Akaku. Pohatu, Toa of Stone, had his armor morphed to an orange color, with dual propeller claws to keep him afloat. And Onua, Toa of Earth, used ankle-mounted propulsion engines in conjunction with a blaster shield combo. As the 6 Toa engaged the 3 blind Makuta, they quickly realized that the Makuta could only see through the eyes of their Shadow Matoran. Targeting the corrupted former Av Matoran, the Toa temporarily drove back the 3 Makuta, giving them a chance to meet up with Tanma and the other Av Matoran to discuss the situation. As Pohatu examined their surroundings, memories flashed before his mind, and he soon realized that not only had the Toa been to Karda Nui before, but it was the source of their original power. Quickly catching up on recent events, the 6 Takanuva realized that Matoro had sacrificed himself to save the universe, and the Kanohi Ignika, Mask of Life, had fallen somewhere in the swamps at the base of Karda Nui. Eventually, the team decided to split up. One half of the team, consisting of Tahu, Gali, and Onua, would fly down to the swamps to search for the Kanohi Ignika, while Kopaka's team of himself, Pohatu, and Liwa stayed to fight Antraz's Makuta strike force. And so, as the Takanuva split up on their separate missions, the final battle for the Matoran universe was upon us, and the stage was set for the ultimate clash between Toa and Makuta. Part 2. Elsewhere in the universe. While the Takanuva fought bravely in Karda Nui, other Toa teams throughout the universe were pursuing their own vital destiny to awaken Mata Nui. The Toa Mari, led by Jaller, were sworn in as the official guardians of Metru Nui, and were immediately thrust into action to defend the city from the rampaging Kardas dragon, which had left Voya Nui after being separated from Vezon and had been drawn to the Grand City of Legends. Meanwhile, the Toa Haga, recently restored from their Rahaga forms and back in the action, had turned over the devious Rudaka into the custody of the Order of Mata Nui, and were given a new task: find and destroy the elusive Makuta Pterodax, who had last been seen in robotic Maxilos form, but whose spirit was nowhere to be found. To aid them in their task, the Order of Mata Nui delivered the Paraka Zaktan to their custody, who had a special telepathic link to Pterodax due to his prolonged antidermis exposure during the events of the Voya Nui saga. As the Haga received their mission, Gaki was struck with a terrifying vision from her Mask of Clairvoyance, which showed the Haga journeying to a place of death, and that one among them would never return. During this time, the Order of Mata Nui dispatched many of its most powerful agents elsewhere in the universe, dealing with trials of their own. After Brutaka had overcome his personal temptation and surrendered the Staff of Artaka to Botar in the pit, the Order of Mata Nui rescued him, fitting him with a breathing helmet to survive on land again and declaring him a probationary member of the Order. Brutaka's first mission brought him to the city of Metru Nui, where he was accompanied by Toa Helrix, leader of the Order, and Krakua, Toa of Sonics, who had finally passed his trials to become a full member of the Order. In Metru Nui, this Order of Mata Nui strike team recovered the ancient sundial of Mata Nui, which Toa Liwa had left in the archives according to a telepathic voice in his head, sent secretly by the Order during their time achieving the Scroll of Preparations. Using a Kanoka disc of shrinking, Brutaka miniaturized the sundial, placing it in the care of Toa Krakua. Elsewhere, Botar and Trinuma, another member of the Order, were on a secret supply run to the weapons manufacturing island of Zia to prepare for Brutaka's next mission. Unbeknownst to the pair of Order agents, but Makuta Icarax, pursuing his own goals, had also been lurking on the island of Zia, and in a surprise attack, he ambushed Botar and Trinuma, using his magnetic power to crush Botar's armor, killing one of the most powerful members of the Order. Barely escaping with his life, Trinuma managed to store the weapons elsewhere and hurried to report the tragic loss to Helryx. Managing to seize Pterodax's old Mask of Shadows, Makuta Icarax returned to the Brotherhood Fortress, crowning himself as the de facto leader of the Brotherhood in Pterodax's absence. Back on Metru Nui, Takanuva, Toa of Light, patrolled the streets, defeating vicious camps of Frostilis Rahi that preyed on the Matoran and serving as guardian of the City of Legends alongside the Toa Mari. Just then, Makuta Icarax descended upon the city with a sole target in mind, Toa Takanuva. As Icarax deployed his shadow leeches, Takanuva was struck by surprise, and to his horror, the leech began to suck the light from him, draining the gold from his armor and filling his mind with dark thoughts. In the final moments of this agonizing struggle, Takanuva managed to blast the leech with a thin ray of light, just before he succumbed to unconsciousness, collapsing on the ground. Pleased with this display, Icarax swiftly departed Metru Nui without alerting the Toa Mari, hoping he had permanently turned Takanuva to the dark. Dimensional Interlude 1: Trials of Takanuva. When he awoke, Takanuva found himself deep beneath the archives, and realized that as a result of his light being partially drained, he now wielded control of both shadow and light. Just then, Toa Helryx, leader of the Order of Madanui, and Toa Krakua of Sonics approached him. Using the mental powers of a specialized Kratana Rahi, Helryx cast Takanuva in a vision of the past. The Toa of Light watched as memories flashed before his eyes, showcasing the Toa Mada training in Karda Nui and being sent to slumber. The visions delved deeper into the past, showing the construction of the Great Spirit Robot himself, and how the Madanui AI consciousness took over from the entity Tren Krong, awakening the heart of Karda Nui and filling the entire land with lethal energy storms. As Takanuva awoke from his vision, Helryx and Krakua informed him that if the Toa Nuva succeeded in awakening Madanui, these devastating energy storms that powered the heart of the robot would be unleashed once more, destroying everything in their path except for the spherical Codex structure within the swamps. Helryx then tasked Takanuva with a vital mission, to warn the Toa Nuva to take refuge within the Codex should they succeed, and aid them in their battle against the Makuta.
As a recap of Chapter 1 beginnings, the Codex was a mysterious metal sphere housed within Karda Nui, which is the heart of the Great Spirit Robot. Inside this metal sphere were 6 giant light stones, which were designed to be fueled by the powers of the 6 Toa Mada. If they fueled their elemental energies into these light stones, they could essentially use these to shock the heart of the Great Spirit Madanui, reawakening him should he ever fall into slumber. Think of it as a giant defibrillator for the massive Madanui robot. Now, of course, as soon as you wake him up, the massive energy storms inside his heart would consume any living being within Karda Nui, killing them instantly because it's essentially a massive factory of energy deep within there.
As Takanuva agreed to follow Helryx's plan, Brutaka emerged from the shadows, introducing himself as a member of the Order of Madanui. Having heard tales of the once greedy fallen warrior, Takanuva was suspicious of the Titan, but was forced to let Brutaka assist him with the power of his Kanohi Olmec, Mask of Dimensional Gates. Krakua then handed Takanuva the shrunken Great Sundial of Madanui, explaining that the great beings themselves had forged the sundial for a singular purpose, to locate the Codex in Karda Nui. And so, Brutaka activated the power of his Olmec, ripping open an interdimensional gateway. As Takanuva prepared for his journey through the inner space between dimensions to teleport to Karda Nui, Brutaka struggled to gain control over his mask, which had been severely damaged in the pressurized waters beneath the pit. As Takanuva rocketed through space and time, he viewed glimpses of other worlds beyond space and time, pushed through countless alternate timelines by the power of the damaged Olmec. For every decision made in the core universe, an alternate timeline sprung up where a different outcome occurred, and the possibilities of this infinite multiverse were endless. Branches of energy rippled through the timeline, and Takanuva found himself thrust from our main timeline, careening into a pocket dimension. When he came to, he found himself surrounded in a forest of black trees and dying grass. Within this strange parallel universe, he came upon a majestic city of silver, rising from the barren wasteland. Within the city, he encountered a breed of biomechanical beings known as Kastora, and over his time spent in this Silver City, he found the Castora to be devious, unfeeling beings, and encountered the Spectral Mask, where after many trials and battles, Takanuva earned the respect of this mysterious being, which opened up a new dimensional gateway for him on his long journey back to our core universe. Dimensional Interlude 2, The Kingdom of Mata Nui. Enter the Kingdom Universe. As Motoro rushed to save the life of the great spirit Mata Nui, he faltered for just a moment, failing to reach Karda Nui in time and dooming the entire universe to darkness and death in this alternate version of our main world. In his failure, Motoro was disgraced, and all in the Matoran universe shunned him, naming him the Disgraced One and forcing him into life in solitude in a tiny hut to himself. As the Matoran universe collapsed and fell into disarray, a mass migration of all species fled in panic from the dying universe, seeking refuge on the island of Mata Nui. It was in this time of chaos that the Order of Mata Nui finally revealed themselves, teaming with Takanuva to beat back the Brotherhood of Makuta and stop them from escaping. In the narrow tunnels to Mata Nui, Huki and Pohatu were tragically killed by rampaging Rakshi, and Jaller, Tahu, and Kopaka were too late to save them. To force the Makuta in, Takanuva erected great barriers of light to instantly destroy any beings of shadow, and in this final act of power, Takanuva of this universe used his remaining light energy to create a team of 6 Toa from the Voya Nui Resistance Team plus Tanma, transforming into a Turaga in the process. In this act of sacrifice, Turaga Takanuva established the kingdom of the Great Spirit, where all previously warring species worked together in harmony to survive. He then named Toa Helrix, Turaga Duma, Rudaka, the Shadowed One, the Skakti warlord Nektan, and a Ninra ghost weapons manufacturer as members of this ruling council. The Dark Hunters became his new law enforcers, and the Toa assisted in keeping the island of Mata Nui together, as well as creating new land to expand this glorious kingdom. 10,000 years after the establishment of the kingdom, the Takanuva of our prime reality found himself careening through interdimensional gateways, finally landing in a blast of energy and light on the shores of this kingdom of Mata Nui. Landing a meeting with his alternate Turaga self, Takanuva was tasked with a new quest. Recent attacks on the kingdom had increased in ferocity, and somehow the Rakshi commanded by Makuta Pterodax were slipping past the barriers of light. Turaga Takanuva then promised to help Toa Takanuva return to our prime universe, should he assist the kingdom in their defense against the beings of shadow. And so, Takanuva was armed with a Power Lance and Midax Skyblaster cannon, teaming with Tanma, now Toa of Light. Before embarking on their mission, Toa Takanuva insisted on visiting Motoro first, convincing the disgraced Toa of Ice to accompany them as a chance to be seen as a hero again. And so, the trio set forth to the abandoned Powahi Borak tunnels, encountering swats of modified Rakshi sporting shadow armor, which allowed them to pass through the barriers. After a long fight with the Rakshi, the 3 Toa watched as a monstrous behemoth emerged from the darkness. This was Makuta Pterodax. He had driven Makuta Icarax from his armor and possessed it, and went on to absorb all other Makuta in his essence. As Takanuva, Tanma, and Motoro engaged this monstrous opponent, Toa Tanma was disintegrated completely, but not before he and Takanuva were able to knock the Mask of Shadows off Pterodax's face and destroy it. In a last-ditch attempt, Makuta Pterodax created a Shadow Hand to absorb Motoro into his essence, and while Takanuva attempted to stop this, Motoro willingly let himself be absorbed, overpowering the will of Pterodax from within, and sacrificing himself to destroy the Makuta. Returning to the surface alone, Takanuva told the populace of the brave sacrifices of Motoro and Tanma, staying just long enough to see a statue made in honor of Motoro until asking the alternate Brutaka of this universe to use his Olmec, ripping open yet another dimensional gate for Takanuva to travel to destinations unknown and get closer to our prime universe. Part 3. Rise of the Ignika. Back in Karda Nui, the Toa Nuva's battle against the Brotherhood of Makuta raged on. As Tahu, Onua, and Gali dove down into the mist-filled swamps of Karda Nui, Kopaka, Pohatu, and Liwa had a chance to talk more with the Matoran of Karda Nui, learning of their past while defending the village from attack. In a brief moment between battle, Solek, the Matoran of Light, told the Toa of the mysterious, fragmented keystone, a device that, according to legend, had an important role to play in awakening Mata Nui. Giving Kopaka his piece of the keystone, Solek explained that there were 5 other hidden keystone pieces scattered across Karda Nui, and the Takanuva would need to collect them to awaken the Great Spirit. Meanwhile, Liwa and Tenma managed to ambush and capture a flying Shadow Matoran who turned out to be Kirop, the former leader of the Av-Matoran village. After Tahu's team arrived in the swamp, they decided to split up in order to cover more ground in their search for the Kanohi Ignika. While searching, Tahu discovered the massive spherical Codex, hurled backwards by the sphere's powerful energy field. As Tahu crashed into the swamp, he was discovered by Makuta Krika, who now sported a monstrous, insectoid appearance due to his exposure to the pit mutagen in the swamp. As Krika approached the fallen Toa of Fire, he began to explain his personal philosophy and motivations, all while using the power of his mask to drain the heat around Tahu. Desperate for help, Tahu then used his remaining power and launched a fireball into the air as a signal to his teammates. Meanwhile, deep within the Makuta's Shadow Leech Hive, which had been erected on the ceiling of the Karda Nui Dome, Mutron and Chirox, the 2 Makuta scientists, were hard at work creating a monstrous Rahi beast by order of Antraz. As they bickered over the qualities of the beast, Chirox summoned a Shadow Matoran to him, throwing the helpless servant into the vat and creating a foul and gruesome Rahi. Arriving at the cave, Antraz explained his plan. The arrival of the Takanuva had foiled their plans to convert all the Karda Nui Matoran to their side, and in order to win the battle, they would need to call on Makuta Ikarax, self-proclaimed leader of the Brotherhood, to turn the tide. Wary of underestimating their opponents, Antraz sent the Rahi abomination out to distract the Toa long enough for Mutron's personal assistant, a Shadow Matoran named Vikan, to split past the Toa and summon Ikarax. Back in the swamps of Karda Nui, Onua fended off wild Nui Kopin Rahi, searching for the Mask of Life. Just then, he was ambushed by Makuta Biddle, who used his time duplication mask to surround Onua with an army of his past selves. Thinking fast, Onua engaged in battle, and as his adaptive armor shifted to mirror a strange blaster Biddle was wielding, Onua struck Biddle with a sphere of energy, sending him plummeting to the swamps below. And as Onua fought Biddle, Gali was attacked by Makuta Gorast in another part of the swamp, but not before claiming another keystone for the Takanuva. As Gorast struck Gali with her light-draining stinger, Tahu's emergency fire blast rose in the distance, and as Gali struggled to get free, Onua arrived on the scene. With Gali saved from Gorast and the Makuta temporarily defeated, Gali and Onua rocketed off to save Tahu and reunite with their team leader. While the Takanuva searched for the keystones in the Ignika, the Mask of Life itself was sitting deep beneath the waters of Karda Nui Swamp. Reaching out with its life energy, the consciousness within the Mask of Life drew the particles drifting through the swamp water to build itself a body. Inspired by Matoro's sacrifice, the Ignika wished to experience life and serve as a hero like Matoro and the rest of the Toamari. And as this new being generated a skyboard, he flew out of the water, sensing the Takanuva up above, hoping to establish the first friendships of his life. And with that, the most powerful Toa in the history of the Matoran universe was born, Toa Ignika, sporting the consciousness of the Mask of Life itself. Interlude: The Federation of Fear. As Takanuva hurtled through the multiverse and the Takanuva faced trials and danger in Karda Nui, the Order of Madanui was occupied with a singular task: find and kill Makuta Pterodax. And so, the Order tasked their probationary member, Brutaka, to assemble a team of outcasts, rejects, and criminals to find and free the former leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta, Makuta Miserix, who Pterodax had overthrown centuries ago and was secretly saved from death by Makuta Krika. And so, after preparations were made and an odd assortment of beings were assembled, Brutaka approached a prison cell holding 5 criminals, captured by the Order of Madanui. As the prisoners awoke in a daze, Brutaka approached to explain their mission, stating that there were 2 and only 2 ways they would ever be allowed to leave their cell: either by carrying out a mission for some friends of his, or by being promptly killed and dumped in an unmarked grave. All the inmates had something in common: they all dealt with the Brotherhood of Makuta at some point in their lives. First up was Rudaka, former queen of the Vizorak, who betrayed the Brotherhood to the Dark Hunters, then betrayed the Dark Hunters as well. Now both sides wanted her dead. Next were Takadox and Karapar, former Baraki whose armies were crushed 80,000 years ago by the Brotherhood, who had been quietly kidnapped from the waters of the pit and recruited for this team. Sulking in the corner of the cell was the 4th member, the disgraced Makuta Spiria, who had fouled up an experiment on the island of Zakaz so badly that his own people marked him for death. This was, of course, the Makuta responsible for mutating the Skakti race into criminal thugs, barbarians, and warriors. And lastly, there was Vezon, who had recently been saved from the Zyglak who dragged him away in the pit and now found himself face to face with the rest of the strike force. Despite Vezon's objections that he had never had any dealings with the Brotherhood, and they likely confused him with his other half, Vezok, Brutaka forced him in line, revealing the second thing that the band of criminals had in common with each other. They were all completely expendable, and their deaths would make no difference in the grand scheme of the universe. As such, this Federation of Fear was made up of the perfect candidates for a suicide mission.
So if you're a fan of DC Comics, it's probably pretty clear exactly what this is. The Federation of Fear is basically Bionicle's answer to the Suicide Squad, and this is actually a direct influence because the writer of Bionicle, Greg Farshti, is a big fan of comic books. Now this story serial is probably one of my favorites throughout all of Bionicle, and it really does wonders to Vezon's character, making him one of the funniest and most entertaining characters in the entire Bionicle world. If the Federation of Fear is Bionicle's version of Suicide Squad, Vezon is definitely Bionicle's version of Deadpool. And unfortunately, because I have to recap the story as quickly and concisely as possible, a lot of Vezon's most funny remarks and actions really aren't covered too closely within this retelling. So if you are interested in this concept and want to learn more about this, definitely go check out the Federation of Fear online story serial, which actually is fully hosted on Biosector 01 today, which is the biggest Bionicle wiki.
Brutaka and his team, Rudaka, Vezon, Karapar, Takadox, and Makuta Spiria, had arrived on the shores of the island of Stealth in a small boat. As soon as Rudaka recognized the skyline, she began to protest. Stealth was the home of the late Sidorak, her former comrade, and his people. Worse, Rudaka had set up Sidorak to be killed, and it was likely everyone on Stealth knew that. But Brutaka insisted they would need a bigger boat to get where they were going, and this was the easiest place to get one. The only other team member to voice an objection was Spiria, who believed Brotherhood of Makuta agents were waiting in every village to grab him. Just as Rudaka began to question Brutaka as to how they would purchase a boat, she was swiftly bound by Karapar, and Brutaka approached the Stealthian craftsman with a deal. He could give them his largest boat, and in return, they would surrender Rudaka to him, or he could claim the bounty for one of the most wanted beings on Stealth. As they bartered, Takadox snuck away, hypnotizing the crew of the ship with his mental powers to jump overboard, while Vezon distracted the traitor long enough for Brutaka to knock him unconscious, ending the ruse and claiming the boat for the Federation. After days of sailing, Makuta Spiria made his move, betraying the team and summoning a contingent of Zyglak to commandeer the boat. Despite this quick and sudden betrayal, Brutaka made no attempt to stop the rogue Makuta, and as Spiria changed course to seek revenge on the Skakti, his Zyglak armies were beset by members of Elex species, allowing Brutaka to regain control of his team and threatened to reveal Spiria's location to the Brotherhood should he attempt to betray them again. It was then that Brutaka revealed the sixth member of the team, the devious Dark Hunter Lariska, who he'd secretly hired to follow them and intervene with Brutaka's allies should any member betray the team. Journeying to the southern regions of the universe, the Federation of Fear came across a barren island, where the weapons collected by Botar and Trinuma had been deposited in haste following the attack by Makuta Icarax. Just as the squad of anti-heroes approached the central cavern on the small island, they began to hear the sounds of a massive organism breathing, a wet, hollow sound as if inhaling through mud. Before the Federation had a chance to flee, vast walls of rock suddenly sprang up from the shoreline, forming a 200-foot-high wall around the island and cutting the team off from their boat. Sharp spears of stone erupted from the ground itself, impaling the wings of Makuta Spiria, who attempted to flee. All around them, a slimy, repulsive voice echoed from deep within the cave. A massive tentacle shot out, wrapping itself around Brutaka and pulling him inside. The next moment, he was in the presence of something so horrible, so alien, that it took all of his willpower just to hold on to his sanity. This was Tren Krom, a writhing, crimson mass of tentacles emerging from a gelatinous central core, with two dead yellow eyes that somehow followed every movement without ever moving themselves.
To recap the prologue in Chapter 1 beginnings, Tren Krom was the original entity the Great Beings created, which was a purely organic being, to rule the entire Matoran universe while they were still constructing the Madanui AI. Of course, once they instated Madanui as the great spirit ruler of the entire robot, there was really no more need for Tren Krom, and he was cast off to live the rest of his life in exile on a remote island where he was basically cut off from the rest of the Matoran universe. Now, Tren Krom has the power to invade the mind of any Matoran universe member who approaches him, and unless they're members of the Order of Madanui who have their minds mentally shielded, he can really just read every single one of your thoughts and even sometimes invade your mind, controlling your body. Tren Krom's appearance is also completely disgusting and horrific. There is no canon image of Tren Krom throughout the entire Bionicle history because the writer Greg Farshti preferred to leave his appearance up for interpretation. That being said, any being to gaze at him for too long will be driven mad because their minds just simply aren't built to comprehend what they are seeing. Of course, behind me, I've put a fan illustration of what Tren Krom could look like, just for purposes of illustration here.
The entity seemed over time to have merged with the stone floor and walls of its cave, so that lurker and place of concealment were one. The acrid stench of decay hung over everything, and in vain, Brutaka tried to break free of the grip of Tren Krom's tentacle. He could feel the strange being trying to probe his mind, but so far Brutaka's mental training had allowed him to resist. If that should fail, he knew the secrets of the Order of Madanui would be exposed to this monster. As Tren Krom demanded they tell him what wonders had come into the universe in the millennia since his exile, Lariska stepped up, claiming that Tren Krom's universe was in danger, and if he kept them there, he would be hurting the one thing he helped bring into being. Karapar edged slowly to the side, sword in hand. No one paid any attention, for all eyes were on Lariska, who had been grabbed by one of Tren Krom's many arms. Without the discipline Brutaka possessed, her mind was an open book to the entity. She screamed as a lifetime of memories were sifted through in an instant, crying out as she saw glimpses of the ancient mind of Tren Krom. When he finally released her, she collapsed on the stone floor, and in the distraction, Karapar began to make a move, raising his sword to strike the entity. Then, a third eye suddenly appeared directly on Tren Krom, one gazing right at Karapar. The Baraki froze in mid-blow. A shaft of energy shot out from the eye, bathing him in its glow, and in the next instant, Karapar shattered into fragments as if he had been made of crystal. There was nothing left of him but a pile of glittering dust on the stone floor. And with Karapar disintegrated, Tren Krom left them with his final words. He had helped birth a world of order, but the denizens of the Matoran universe had turned it into a universe of madness and fear. It was no longer worth saving to him, and he saw it as greater punishment to condemn the rest of the Federation to their deserved fate, life in the universe they and their kind had made. With no one taking the time to argue, they gathered up Brutaka and Lariska, fleeing the cave even as the stone walls that surrounded the island receded into the sand. Only Takadox paused to look back at the cavern where Karapar had died, wondering for a moment just what it would take to end the life of a being older than the stars. As the band of misfits journeyed onwards, they finally reached their destination. Looming out of the mist was an island of black sand and jagged rock, volcanic peaks and strange rahi arcing and wheeling through the sky. Despite the bright light that played off the waters around it, the island seemed to be in perpetual shadow. This was the island of Ardadax, home to the imprisoned Makuta Miserix. As the squad crept into the tunnels deep beneath the island, they heard the entrance slam shut behind them, and realized the devious Takadox had sealed them in. Now down to just Brutaka, Vezon, Rudaka, Lariska, and Makuta Spiria, the team ventured ever onwards, with Spiria being threatened with death should he not join them. As they blasted past strange rahi and automated defenses, they came upon the largest occupant of the chamber, a massive dragon-like beast chained to the stone floor. All around it flew much smaller rahi, darting and dodging the shadow hand that occasionally shot out from the creature's chest. This 40-foot-tall creature was Makuta Miserix, original leader of the Brotherhood, now chained to the caverns and surrounded by strange, flying clack rahi with piercing sonic screams. Glancing around the chamber at the squad, Miserix caught sight of Makuta Spiria, and in an instant activated his shadow hand, devouring Spiria's essence and absorbing his life force, for Spiria had been one of the first to side with Pterodax in their revolt. Now down to just 4, the Federation of Fear began to attempt to convince Miserix to join them, breaking his chains and freeing the monstrous dragon Makuta. Despite Rudaka's attempts to betray the team and side with Miserix alone, the great dragon was convinced by Rudaka's promise, a promise of revenge against Makuta Pterodax in exchange for working with them. And so, as the dragon sprouted wings, Brutaka, Lariska, Vazon, and a stunned Rudaka climbed on his back. They soared high above the island, pausing only long enough for Miserix to make a muttered vow to come back and destroy the place one day. Brutaka noted that the team's boat was gone. Takadox had gotten away. But it was of no concern to Brutaka, who stayed firm in his resolve. A storm was coming to this universe, and when it hit, there would be nowhere for anyone to hide. Miserix spread his wings and turned to the north, carrying his passengers into the unknown. Part 4. Shadows in the Sky. As the Federation of Fear freed Makuta, Miserix, and Takanuva continued spiraling through dimensions, Tahu's team of Takanuva in the swamps of Karda battled the armies of Makuta, uncovering secrets of the Codex and Keystones. High in the skies above Karda, the team led by Kopaka interrogated the captured Shadow Matoran Kirop after seizing his piece of the Keystone. After realizing the Matoran's mind had been twisted by darkness, the Toa decided to trick the Matoran of Shadow, allowing him to overhear a false conversation about a planned raid on the Shadow Leech Hive, the location of which the Toa had still not deciphered, but hoped to trick Kirop into leading them there. As expected, the loyal Shadow Matoran blasted through his makeshift prison, making a beeline for the secret location of the Hive, with Kopaka, Pohatu, Liwa, and the Av Matoran right on his heels. Just then, the team of heroes encountered the monstrous Rahi the Makuta scientists cooked up, and just as they were about to succumb to the jaws of the multi-headed monstrosity, Toa Ignika, the consciousness of the Mask of Life, rocketed into action, using the power of life to rapidly age the creature, sending it plummeting to the ground and dying of old age. In the commotion, the Toa failed to recognize that this mysterious, mute stranger was actually bearing the Mask of Life, but readily accepted all the help they could get, and together they flew onwards to the Shadow Leech Hive. As Kirop approached the Shadow Leech Hive, Vikon had already fled to summon Icarax, and the scientist Mutron watched as the Toa and Matoran approached in the distance. Barring the door shut to buy himself some time, Mutron conjured up several illusions with his unique powers, disguising the vats of shadow leeches as solid rock. Just then, the Toa blasted the door open, with Kopaka staying to fight Makuta Mutron while the rest of the Toa flew deeper within the hive in search for the shadow leech vats, unaware they were right before their eyes. As Liwa, Pohatu, Toa Ignika, and the Av Matoran soared through tunnel after tunnel, they grew confused, passing by all the disguised vats and venturing deeper into the Makuta's lair. Just then, Liwa and Pohatu turned in fear, and directly behind them was a snarling, white-skinned Rahi, primed to attack. Little did they know, but this was actually Toa Ignika, whom Mutron had projected another illusion over to trick the Toa into fighting amongst themselves. As Liwa and Pohatu attacked the disguised Toa Ignika, the Mask of Life reacted angrily, slowing their life processes to end their existence. Meanwhile, as Kopaka continued to fight Mutron, he was dazed for a split second by fear powers, allowing Mutron to use his mental abilities to begin to drive the Toa of Ice insane. And as the battle with Mutron raged on, Pohatu and Liwa begged Toa Ignika to stop killing them, realizing in shock and confusion that the mysterious stranger was wearing the Mask of Life. As they pleaded with the mask, the other Makuta burst in the hive, Antraz rallying Vampra and Chirox to defend their lair and strike back against the Toa. Knocking Kopaka unconscious with their powers of shattering and magnetism, the three Makuta reinforcements proceeded to use their power screams to knock out the rest of the fighting Takanuva and Matoran, ending the battle within the lair. As the Toa fought within the Shadow Leech lair, the Shadow Matoran Vikon, scientific assistant, touched down on the Makuta fortress on Destro, using a tablet of transit to gain access to the Brotherhood fortress. Shocked, Vikon saw Icarax sitting on Makuta Pterodax's old throne, wearing Pterodax's old Mask of Shadows and fresh from killing the teleporting Botar. Despite Icarax scoffing at the fact that Antraz would attempt to give him orders, he agreed to go to Karda and join the fight, if only to persuade his fellow Makuta to abandon Pterodax's plan and side with him instead. As Vikon returned to Karda, Icarax gathered his weapons, preparing for war. Meanwhile, within the Shadow Leech Hive, Pohatu managed to escape captivity with his powers of stone, freeing Toa Ignika, who slowly began to trust him again. Thinking fast, Pohatu activated his Kanohi Kakamanuva, Mask of Speed, and vibrated through the Shadow Leech vats, shattering the glass and casting the Makuta into mayhem. In the confusion, the Toa Matoran and Ignika escaped, with Toa Ignika using his powers of life to snap the semi-organic stone holding up the hive, bringing the Makuta crashing to the ground. As both sides regrouped for a final battle in the skies, Makuta Icarax arrived on the scene, rendezvousing with his fellow Makuta and agreeing to defeat Toa Ignika and claim the Mask of Life, if only for his own amusement. And so, the last battle over the villages of Karda Nui began, with the Makuta flying over the village, spreading shadow over the remaining village of light. Just before breaking off from the formation, Mutron and Icarax struck the roof of Karda Nui with lightning. Antros used his weather control power to create a storm, and Vempra and Chirox alternated the use of their sonics and cyclone powers to destroy all the Matoran homes and light vines. Revealing the hiding place of the Toa and Matoran, they were stunned to find it completely empty, for the Toa had flown back to what remained of the Makuta's lair to seize their piece of the keystone. And so, when the Makuta returned to their lair, a heated battle began. Antros fired off deadly beams of heat vision, only for Kopaka to form a hail of ice, redirecting them at the Makuta and piercing his armor. As some of Antros's antidermis essence began to leak out, Chirox and Kirop engaged Pohatu and Liwa, and in a thrilling conclusion to this epic battle, Icarax activated his powerful gravity abilities, sending all around him hurtling downwards to the swamp, including Pohatu, the Avmatoran Photok, as well as Antros and his Shadow Matoran servant Radiac. While the battle was completely over, Kopaka and Liwa broke off from the attack to dive after Pohatu, spiraling down to the mysterious Swamp of Secrets. Up to this point, Toa Ignika had not participated in the battle because he was too overwhelmed by the course of the fight. However, after seeing Pohatu careen into the swamp, Ignika was enraged, flying directly at Icarax with his Blade of Life. Recognizing the Mask of Life, Icarax acted swiftly, using his density control power to let the blade pass through him, then increasing the density of his fist to punch Ignika off his skyboard. Just as Icarax reached down to take the Mask of Life, Ignika cursed him, reversing his evolution until all his antidermis transformed back into organic tissue, and dealing Icarax waves of excruciating pain, for his armor was intended for energy, not organs and muscle. Capturing Icarax and the scientist Mutron, Ignika prepared to fight the rest of the Makuta, who fled from the gruesome scene. And with the battle temporarily over, both the Toa and Makuta were scattered, wounded, and reeling from the climactic clash in the sky. Interlude, Destiny War, Part 1. As battles continued in Karda Nui and Takanuva grew ever closer to returning to his home universe, the Order of Madanui Fortress on Daxia was on high alert. Brutaka's suicide mission had succeeded, and the colossal dragon-like Makuta Miserix had been brought to the Order's main stronghold. As Axon stood firm as a defender of Voyanui, he was contacted by Toa Krakua under orders of Helrix to return to the fortress at once, for all agents of the Order of Madanui were being recalled back to their stronghold to prepare for an all-out destiny war. As Axon arrived on Daxia, he was brought face to face with his old friend, once mortal enemy, Brutaka, for the first time since their battles on Voyanui. Astonished to see Brutaka redeemed and once again a full-fledged member of the Order, Axon was overjoyed, finally reuniting with Brutaka. But there was no time to catch up, for Toa Helrix had put out a major announcement. After all these years, the Order was about to come out of hiding. First of the Order of Madanui's agents to respond was Mazika, the Ko-Matoran warrior who had held a brutal rivalry with the Ta-Matoran Voltraz, now servant of Makuta Icarax, for killing his mentor years ago in a senseless spree of murders. Mazika was training with fellow Order of Madanui agent Tobduck when he heard Helrix's call, and his first destination was to seek out and detain his old rival Voltraz, who potentially held great secrets to be used against a brotherhood. Sailing forth to the island of Stelt, Mazika tortured a Ninra ghost for information about Voltraz, learning that the devious Voltraz had paid that Matoran to build a sleek skyfighter for him. After learning that Voltraz was headed for Karda Nui, Mazika made a beeline for the Order of Madanui headquarters, demanding to be told of the secret location to the entrance of Karda Nui. There, he met up with his old partner Tobduck, who promised to lead him to Karda Nui after Mazika helped him attack the Brotherhood of Makuta's fortress on Destro, in the hopes that they could force the armies of the Makuta to teleport directly to Metru Nui and be faced with the Order's most powerful legions there. Meanwhile, on the beaches of the island of Odina, Dark Hunter's stronghold, Ancient, the right hand of the Shadowed One, and secret double agent for the Order of Madanui, stood on the beach, waiting for Lariska to return from her suicide mission. As strange birds flew in unique patterns in the sky, Ancient received a coded message from the Order of Madanui, convinced the Shadowed One to side with the Order in their war against Makuta, or kill him personally. Next on the list of the Order's allies was the resurrected jailer Hydraxon, who had once fought alongside Toa Helrix in his original form and would answer the call to battle once again. Plunging deep within the black waters of the pit, Toa Lezovic met up with Hydraxon, who had just received a list of secret orders from Helrix. As the two warriors paced through the now partially reconstructed pit prison, Hydraxon came upon the 4 remaining Baraki warlords, Prydak, Kalma, Mantax, and Elek, who he had rounded up and recaptured over the past few months. Promising their freedom and a chance to rebuild the League of Six Kingdoms, Hydraxon convinced the Baraki to fight with the Order against the Brotherhood, a chance the Baraki readily accepted to return to the land once again. Back in the fortress of the Order, Vezon had been thrown back in a cell alongside Rudaka. Across from him were makeshift water tanks holding what remained of the Paraka, all except Zaktan, who had been sent off with the Toahaga on a secret mission months ago. In the opposite tank was the mad titan Karzani, now driven fully insane and mutated by the waters of the pit. Just then, the crimson-armored Order of Madanui agent Trinuma opened the door to his cell, and despite Vezon's claims that they must have freed him to draw on his self-proclaimed great intellect and strategic expertise, Trinuma merely replied that the Order needed someone who could die horribly without being missed. And just like that, Vezon was recruited to yet another suicide mission. As the Order began to make their moves, the first mission was to the Skakti-ruled island of Zakaz, where the Order wished to make a deal with the Skakti warlord Nektan to arrange an alliance between them. And as Axon and Brutaka were brought before Nektan, they lied, claiming that they had already gained the allegiance of other Skakti warlords to share in the spoils of war with the Brotherhood, and Nektan would be missing out on sacking their fortresses, looting their weapons, and slaying their warriors. And so, Nektan agreed to lead his Skakti forces in a battle against the Makuta's armies, and first in their sights with a contingent of vicious Rakshi, sons of Makuta, on a neighboring island. Meanwhile, the Toahaga were on mission for the Order of Madanui to uncover the secret hiding place of Makuta Pterodax. Led by the devious Zaktan, who now was little more than a head and spine floating in a makeshift fishbowl, the Toahaga had arrived in the gates of Metronui with a terrible mission: destroy the Colosseum, for Makuta Pterodax likely seeped in gaseous form beneath the structure to secret caverns below. As the Haga arrived in the Colosseum, they were confronted by Jalar and the Toamari, who were on edge due to the mysterious disappearance of Takanuva, and willing to defend Metronui at all costs. Despite the Haga attempting to explain their mission to find Makuta Pterodax and destroy the Colosseum in the process, the Toamari refused to believe them, and seeing the Haga as a threat to the city, the two Toa teams engaged in a destructive conflict throughout the city of Metronui. As this was happening, Trinuma explained Vezon's mission: to arrive at the Makuta fortress on Destral, where he would likely be killed, and pretend to betray the Order of Madanui, announcing an attack on the Makuta fortress in the hopes that the Makuta would activate the ancient teleportation engine within, which could move the entire stronghold anywhere in the Matoran universe. As Vezon was captured on arrival, to his surprise, he was led to the only Makuta left on Destral, a lone warrior named Tridax, who was the sole Makuta left to guard the fortress while Entraz's strike force and Icarax were away in Karda Nui. Just then, a blast rocked the side of the fortress, and to Tridax and Vezon's surprise, the fortress was already seemingly under attack. Mazika and Tobduk had arrived to bring their deceptive plan to motion, hoping Tridax would teleport the great fortress and all of the Makuta's armies to Metronui. Far to the west, Prydak watched as another Brotherhood of Makuta fortress outpost burned and smiled at the sight. He had been fortunate since his release from the pit. His captors had provided him with ships and the resources with which to raise an army. From the worst holes in the universe, Prydak had found ex-Dark Hunters, exiled Vortex, even a Skakti or two for his crews. Before Kalma even had a chance to devise a battle plan, Prydak had sounded off without him on a voyage of conquest. His men had routed the forces of the Makuta who occupied this place, but had found no actual member of the Brotherhood of Makuta, for all of them were occupied in Karda Nui. And as Prydak claimed this Makuta refuge, he discovered the pieces to a grand tablet on the wall, inscriptions detailing dark plans and evil schemes. Piecing together the message, Prydak sent his armies outside as he alone sat and read the inscriptions, for this was the grand plan of Makuta Pterodax himself. Meanwhile, back on the islands near Zakaz, Axon and Brutaka stood on a steep rise overlooking a battlefield. Down below, the assembled might of the Skakti of Zakaz were locked in combat with a small army of Rakshi. Initially, the Skakti had suffered horrible losses, but they were capable of something that the Rakshi could only pretend: rage. Hungry for victory and filled with hatred for their enemy, the barbarians regrouped and tore through the Rakshi ranks. To Axon, it was overwhelming, thrilling, and sickening all at once. And as the Skakti distracted the Rakshi battalions, Brutaka and Axon crept past the battle and came upon an ancient sanctum. Before them was the pool of mysterious green antidermis, the original pool where the Great Spirit Madanui first created the Makuta long ago. Discovered by order of Madanui informants as the source of all new Makuta, Axon and Brutaka made plans to destroy the vast pool once and for all, ending the threat of potential new Makuta. As they prepared to strike, the waters of the pool suddenly exploded upwards and outwards. Foul, scalding liquid struck Axon and Brutaka, seeping into the openings in their masks and armor. It hissed and writhed like a thing alive, burning wherever it touched. Temporarily blinded and in pain, the two warriors staggered and then stumbled, plunging into the pool itself. Back in the Shadowed One's lair, Ancient managed to convince the Dark Hunter ruler to ally with the Order of Madanui, his hatred for the Brotherhood of Makuta fueling his actions above all. As the Shadowed One recalled all Dark Hunters to fight for the Order, their first mission was to seize the island of Zia, pacifying the local vortex and preventing them from joining the Brotherhood like their devious Rudaka. With the population of Zia imprisoned and corralled in a matter of hours, the Shadowed One had grown bored, coming across a vortex worker frantically clearing rubble to seize a treasure deep within. Binding the worker with crystalline protodermis from his staff, the Shadowed One began to dig, never taking his eye off the vortex. The deeper he got, the more visibly upset the Xian natives seemed to be. Several feet down, he came upon a proto-steel box. Burned into the lid was the symbol of the Brotherhood of Makuta. Opening the box carefully, the Shadowed One's eyes widened as he gazed upon a mysterious set of virus vials, which may soon make him master of the universe. And in the far edges of the universe, skies darkened as the great Makuta dragon Miserix roamed free once again. Announcing to all corners of the world that he was back, Makuta Miserix began his sole mission to find and kill Makuta Pterodax, in the hopes of finally getting revenge on the man behind his suffering for eons of years. During all these events at the start of the Destiny War with the Brotherhood of Makuta, Toa Helrix, original Toa and leader of the Order of Madanui, sat in the command chamber of her fortress on Daxia. The war against the Brotherhood of Makuta had begun, and it had not begun well. Although the Order, through the Dark Hunters, now held Zia, they had been unable to dislodge Makuta forces from the island of Ninra. In other places, the Order's surprise attacks had met unexpectedly fierce resistance from Rakshid and Exo-Toa. With battles erupting on multiple fronts and the brunt of the Makuta's legions currently occupying Karda Nui, Helrix had little to do but watch and wait, observing where the Great War would lead. The greatest conflict in the history of the Matoran universe had just begun by her hand, and the outcome would change the destinies of all who called the Matoran universe home.
Again, going back to the comic book references, this time with Marvel, the Destiny War, which was led by Toa Helrix, the leader of the Order of Madanui, is basically Bionicle's version of Marvel's Infinity War, where everyone rallied together from all different parts of the universe against a major threat. This is why there's just so many characters doing so many different things throughout the universe, because all of this is culminating in one final battle. But we'll get there in a second, and the outcome of at least the movie version of Infinity War is remarkably similar to the Bionicle version of Destiny War. But we'll get there in a little bit.
Part 5. Swamp of Secrets. As the Destiny War broke out throughout the universe, engaging all major players and factions, the Takanuva and the Makuta and Karda Nui were none the wiser, engaged in their own heated conflict for the heart of the Great Spirit Madanui. While Kopaka led his team in raids on the Shadow Leech Hive in the skies above Karda Nui, and the Mask of Life rocketed upwards in the form of Toa Ignika to join the fight, Tahu, Onua, and Gali were still locked in battle with Makuta's Krika, Gorast, and Biddle in the swamps below Karda Nui. Still battling with Krika, Tahu had just sent up his emergency flare when Gali and Onua rushed to his aid. In the skies above, explosions echoed from the fight with the other Toa, and Makuta, Gorast, Biddle, and Krika rushed to save the falling Makuta Chirox, who had been caught in Icarax's gravity blast. In this lull in the conflict, the Toa Nuva in the swamp were stunned to encounter a clearing of Av Matoran. Watching from a distance, they observed as the Matoran lay on the ground, writhing as electronics replaced organics, and the once sentient individual beings evolved into the mindless Borak. To Tahu's horror, he realized that all the Borak they had fought on Madanui years ago were once Matoran, and this was a natural part of their life cycles. In this clearing now filled with Borak, Tahu and his team claimed another piece of the keystone, dropped by a Matoran that had now been fully evolved into a Borak. From there, the Takanuva of the swamps had little time to ponder this dramatic reveal about the true nature of their world, for the Makuta were distracted by the falling Chiroks, and now was the time to strike. In a surprise attack, the Toa launched into a volley of attacks, each temporarily knocking out their opponents to claim yet another piece of the keystone. During this brief conflict, the Makuta of the swamps were distracted yet again by a telepathic message from the other Makuta in the skies. Ikarax had fallen, and the Kanohi Ignika, Mask of Life, had created a Toa form of its own, who had bested the Makuta with a fraction of its power. Stunned by this revelation, the Makuta were too late to prevent Tahu's team from escaping to the Codex, and instead decided to lay in wait for the Toa near the Codex entrance, ready to ambush them at their destination. In the swamp, Tahu and his team arrived at the Codex, where they met steep resistance from the Makuta. Despite Krika's attempts to have a conversation with Tahu and convince him that both sides were doomed to lose should Pterodax succeed, the hot-headed Tahu merely continued attacking Krika with fireballs. Forced to lower his density, Krika allowed the flames to pass right through him, only half-heartedly fighting back. For Gali and Onua, however, their opponents lashed out with unrestrained force. As the battle continued, Krika informed Tahu that he should check his surroundings, and as Tahu looked behind him, he watched as the other Makuta from the skies, led by Antraz, were on a direct course to the swamp. And as all available Makuta rallied around the Swamp of Secrets, the Toa were about to be overwhelmed. Dimensional Interlude 3: Empire of Fallen Toa. Thousands of years ago, in our prime universe, the deranged serial killer Toa Tuyet attempted to frame the Dark Hunters for her spree of murders around the city of Metru Nui in her quest to keep the Nui Stone. But unlike our main universe, just as Toa Likan confronted Tuyet, in this dark mirror alternate world, Toa Nadiki instead chose to side with Toa Tuyet, and the pair of corrupted Toa killed Likan. The Dark Hunters were successfully blamed for the murders, and Tuyet set about convincing the other Toa that they were better off forcefully protecting the Matoran, forming an empire in order to deal with threats. Along with the Dark Hunters, the Brotherhood of Makuta were targeted for extinction, and the weapons manufacturer Ninra Ghosts were also attacked, because their creations could potentially be used against the Empire. The existence of the Toa Mata was discovered, and Tuyet sent the signal to launch their Toa canisters, freeing them to join the Toa Empire. As Taragaduma was publicly opposed to the Empire's ruthlessness, he was quietly dealt with Tuyet toppling his rule and establishing her grand regime over all of Metru Nui as a base of operations for her new Empire of Toa. While some, like Toa Lesovic, fought back, sticking to their morals and values, most of the Toa Mata came to serve Tuyet, as their loss of memories made it easier to mold them to accept this new status quo. Years passed, and this ruthless Toa Empire grew in power, killing all those who opposed them and imprisoning the rest in secret torture chambers within Metru Nui. It was at this time of expansion and oppression that a great portal opened in the sky above this alternate Metru Nui, transporting the Toa Takanuva of our prime universe to this dark mirror world. Encountering the Matoran Kapura in the streets, his old friend from the island of Madanui, Takanuva was shocked to see the Matoran beg for his life before him, and statues of the Toa Mata lining every street. As Kapura begged Takanuva to let him pass, the temperature dropped sharply all around them, and in an instant, Kapura was locked in a foot-thick shell of ice from the neck down, just enough to make him feel the excruciating pain of the intense cold. As Kapura cried out in pain, Takanuva looked up to see Toa Kopaka descending upon them, accompanied by Toa Tahu. As they demanded to see Takanuva's identity tablet, Kopaka brought his sword to his neck, imprisoning him as an enemy of the Toa Empire. Tossing Takanuva in a dark cell, Tahu merely laughed at his protests, refusing to answer his questions and locking him deep within the Colosseum of Metru Nui. As Takanuva examined his cell, a weak voice echoed from behind him. Illuminating the cell with a fraction of his light power, Takanuva saw a Matoran hanging from the wall, with chains around his wrists and ankles. This imprisoned Matoran was none other than Takua, an alternate version of Takanuva himself that had never become a Toa of Light. Freed by his variant, Takua began to explain the history of the Toa Empire universe, and how he, like countless other Matoran, had been left to rot in prison for not meeting the Toa's strict productivity requirements. When Gali and Karzani's Matoran re-education facilities failed, and even hours of Vaki conditioning failed to break the will of Takua, they had simply dumped him in the cell for all of eternity. As Takanuva took in Takua's tales of the state of this universe, he was resolved to immediately escape and return to his main world, but not without trying to improve this dark mirror dimension first. Escaping from their cell, Takanuva and Takua crept through the archives, which to Takanuva's disgust had been converted to a twisted trophy room of fallen foes, a museum of conquest and suffering. A long-dead and mounted Vizrak Karpa stared from the shadows with glassy eyes. A collection of weaponry was nearby, each item identified with a small inscribed tablet. The Staff of the Shadowed One, Spear of Fusion, Zammersphere launchers, Rotuka launchers, and more. Next to those was the most amazing sight of all, the Kanohi Mask of Shadows, property of the leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta, now nailed to the wall like just another trophy. And most terrifying of all was a massive stasis tube, imprisoning Duma to barely keep him alive in eternal suffering. Acting fast to free the Turaga, Takanuva introduced himself, begging Duma to trust him and help fix this broken world. As the trio of escapees delved deeper within the archives, they came face to face with two hooded, cloaked beings of shadow, the Makuta of this universe. Behind them echoed a voice all too familiar to Takanuva, the voice of Makuta Pterodax. In this world, he wore a rusted and pitted Kanohi Hao, explaining that even touching his former Mask of Shadows would immediately alert Toa Tuyet and her Vaki enforcers. Threatening to kill Takanuva and his companions, the Toa of Light revealed himself, stating that he was in opposition to Tuyet's rule, and his powers as a Toa of Light could help turn the tide of battle in their favor. Pterodax and Makuta Krika offered Takanuva a deal. They would help him find this universe's version of Brutaka to transport him back to the main universe, but only if Takanuva agreed to help the Makuta claim a valuable artifact to fight back against the Toa Empire, the legendary Mask of Time, which in this universe had been forged by Artaka himself. This Mask of Time was en route to Metru Nui in the hands of a Toa Empire convoy, protected by Toa Bomanga and Koalas, and led by fanatical Matoran Jaller, Takanuva's old friend in the Prime Dimension, now turned devout servant of the Toa Empire. Cooking up a specialized virus that gave Takanuva the power of flight, Makuta Krika and Pterodax bid him on his journey, agreeing to protect Takua and Turaga Duma while he was away. And so, Takanuva encountered the procession, introducing himself to Jaller, Koalas, and Bomanga. Claiming to be one of Tuyet's secret Toa enforcers, Takanuva managed to earn their trust, learning that the Brutaka of this universe had been killed by Toa Bomanga himself during the Empire's so-called lawful expedition to Voya Nui. Right before Takanuva was about to be exposed, a gust of wind swept past the caravan, and in an instant, the two Toa Haga and Jaller were downed, and in their place was Toa Lesovic, who had spared Takanuva's life in the hopes that he would aid him in the rebellion against the Toa Empire. And under the cover of darkness, Toa Lesovic and Takanuva darted through the sculpture fields of Po-Mitru. Leading Takanuva to a misshapen and haphazard throne of stone, Lesovic introduced him to this universe's version of Toa Pohatu, former enforcer for the Toa Empire, now leader of the resistance efforts against the brutal dictatorship. Pohatu explained that over time, he had grown wary of Tuyet's regime, and the final straw was the senseless massacre of 4 dozen Matoran, which Pohatu refused to be a part of. After making contact with Lesovic, Pohatu had established a full-on resistance effort, comprised of Makuta, Dark Hunters, and even Matoran within the Toa Empire's ranks as secret agents. Joining this resistance was the Matoran Akmau, who had been a devious trickster in Takanuva's Prime Universe, but in this world, any being opposing the Toa was an ally to Takanuva. As the resistance team met in Pohatu's secret hideout, their plan was laid out. Akmau would alert every available Makuta in the city, while the Dark Hunter Darkness would rally together what remained of their organization. Any Matoran or Toa willing to revolt would be drafted into the rebellion, and in one night, every force that sought to oppose the Toa Empire would descend upon the city in a full-scale assault. It was a dangerous plan, but Takanuva had no choice but to agree, if he wanted any chance of breaking into the Colosseum and stealing Brutaka's old Olmec. It had all started out so well. Lesovic's band had made it close to the Colosseum before being spotted. As planned, Takanuva used his newfound shadow powers to blind the guards, Pohatu following with a massive fist of stone that cracked the walls of the huge structure. To the east, Makuta Pterodax led Makuta Krika, Makuta Kojol, Taragaduma, and Takua into battle. At first, they made short work of the Matoran and Toa who guarded Tuyet's fortress. Then, it went all wrong. A Toa of iron appeared on the walls, and to Takanuva's horror, a hail of spikes impaled Takua, ripping his body to shreds and killing Takanuva's alternate self. Makuta Kojol fell next, his armor crushed by the Toa's power and his essence incinerated by a Toa of plasma. Forced to pull back, Pterodax fled from his opponents, circling back to aid Lesovic's squad. The Dark Hunter Primal had run into Tahu in the eastern entrance, and in a surprise attack managed to kill the Toa of Fire. As revenge, Gali summoned a sphere of water around Primal's head, suffocating him on dry land. Toa Krakua hit Gali with a wave of solid sound, blasting apart her mask and armor, and Bohatu cried out too late, for Akmau had already dashed ahead and slain the fallen Toa of Water. He didn't get to enjoy his triumph long, for Kopaka flash froze Akmau, and a swipe from Onua's claws shattered the Matoran into little pieces of crystal and protodermis. Now, it was no longer one battle, but a dozen separate ones being fought at once, the lines moving back and forth. Pohatu fought his way into the Colosseum, but found himself too evenly matched with Onua to make much progress. Lesovic fell with an ice dagger in his shoulder, but rallied to blow Kopaka off his post high atop the Colosseum. Takanuva only could wince as a Toa of ice hit the ground and lay still. As Takanuva, Pterodax, and Darkness rallied to storm the gates of the Colosseum, a battle like no other lay ahead of them. All around him, allies fell and familiar faces cried out in pain and death. Surrounded by suffering, Takanuva found the resolve to charge ahead, blasting his way past a group of Toa and finally reaching the inner chamber, the throne room of Toa Tuyet. There, framed in the chamber doors, was Tuyet, Nui stone in one hand, mask of dimensional gates in the other. Takanuva barely had a chance to react before he was blown through half a dozen walls by a focused tidal wave, Tuyet immediately making the first move to kill the outsider. Takanuva charged, and the next few seconds were a blaze of battle. Lasers turning water to steam, waves crashing against walls, a race to see what would happen first, Takanuva drowning in the tide or Tuyet drowning in darkness. When the fight was through, Tuyet stood once more triumphant. But just then, a distant sound echoed through the halls of the Colosseum, and as the two combatants surveyed the now demolished central square of Metru Nui, they could hear the sound of thousands of armed Matoran marching up to the building, finally rising up against the oppressive regime. In the distance, Takanuva could see airships and sea-going vessels carrying other Matoran, Dark Hunters, Vortex, and other beings, all bent on descending on the city, their eyes fixed on the Colosseum. In a moment of distraction, Tuyet activated the Mask of Dimensional Gates, intending to scour the multiverse to raise an army to return and crush the rebellion once and for all. As an energy portal opened in the center of the room, Takanuva seized the opportunity to steal the Olmec, snatching the mask from her face. The second it lost contact with her, its power shut off and the portal began to slowly close. Takanuva, mask in hand, dove through, but Tuyet was not about to let him escape so easily. And even as he cleared the portal, she grabbed onto his leg, trying to follow him. Blasting him with hard bolts of water, Tuyet caught his hand and tore the mask, causing it to float away in the space between dimensions. Takanuva turned back, and what he saw horrified him. Tuyet was halfway through the portal, trying to drag Takanuva back in. She was so consumed by rage that she never noticed the portal closing until it was much too late. Screaming as the gates of reality slammed shut on her body, Tuyet's upper half was left in the void, and her lower half in the Colosseum on her world. Mercifully, death came instantly. Takanuva hovered in the inner space for a long moment. He wondered what would happen in Tuyet's universe with her gone. Would the Toa become protectors again? Would the Matoran take control? Or would some group of the Dark Hunters and Makuta become the new dictators? Perhaps someday, if he was able, he would return to find out the answer. Turning his head away from the remains of Tuyet, wondering how a Toa could go so wrong, Takanuva realized with a shudder what a fine line it could be between justice and tyranny. Tuyet's life had been wasted, but the lives of no more Toa would be lost if he could prevent it. With grim resolve, he resumed his journey to Karda Nui, and as he opened a dimensional gateway which would finally bring him back to his core universe, it's time to return to Karda Nui and return to the events of the core timeline and battles being fought and won during Takanuva's multiversal journey. Part 6. Battle for the Codex. Meanwhile, back in Karda Nui, the final battle was about to begin. As Toa Ignika held guard over Makuta, Icarax, and Mutron, the rest of the Takanuva followed the Makuta deep into the swamp. Reunited at last and combining all the pieces of the Keystone, the 6 Takanuva engaged in the final battle for the Matoran universe. Hurtling towards each other through the air, each Toa locked in battle with each Makuta. After a brief struggle with Tahu, Vampra had flown into the mist and now silently hunted the cautious Toa of Fire. Krika, who had been attacked by Gali, finally decided to make his moves while the Makuta were distracted. Partially draining some of Gali's energy, Krika carried her off into the swamp, hoping to have a peaceful conversation. Liwa, Kopaka, and Onua failed to notice this, occupied with the rest of the Makuta while Pohatu battled Gorast one-on-one, unable to deal any significant damage while the Makuta used the powers of her mass to disrupt his elemental power of stone. During this, Tahu managed to hurl a fireball at the plants below Vampra, causing a massive explosion and distracting the Makuta long enough to rejoin his friends. With Gorast distracted, Pohatu regained control over his elemental powers, reuniting with the Takanuva and realizing that Gali and Krika were missing. Still flying towards the Codex, Tahu ordered Pohatu to find Gali, while he went off to help the others fight. Away from the battle, Krika spoke with Gali, still dazed from the attack. Revealing to her that he had secretly betrayed Pterodax and left Makuta Miserix alive, Krika outlined the history of the Brotherhood of Makuta. As they spoke, Krika gave Gali a tablet of transit and told her to leave Karda Nui before the other Toa could awaken Mata Nui so she could save herself from the death that awaited all who lingered there. Questioning his motives, Gali continued to doubt Krika, who simply told her that he wished to be different from the other Makuta and show mercy rather than an endless cycle of pain and death. Meanwhile, back in the former lair of the Makuta, Mutron's assistant Vikon was left to guard the equipment and Rahi experiments. One of these Rahi, the perplexing clock creature, attacked Vikon from a shattered vat with a piercing sonic scream. To Vikon's confusion, he felt the shadow within him begin to drain, replaced back with his Mora light and returning him to a Le Matoran, and Vikon came to the crucial realization that the Rahi Clack held the power to revert the Shadow Matoran back to their true selves and cure the Shadow Leech infection. But just as Gali was about to ask Krika about the true nature of Pterodax's plan, a bolt of lightning coursed through the sky, and a crackling dimensional gate ripped open in front of Gali and Krika. Emerging from the portal was Takanuva at last. Due to his nature as a Toa of Light, Takanuva felt the raw energy of Karda Nui fueling him, increasing his size to titanic scale and feeding energy and light throughout his entire body. Firing a bolt of light at Krika, Takanuva forced the Makuta to escape, sinking beneath the waters of the swamp with a resigned look on his face. For he had tried to warn Gali, but with the arrival of a Toa of Light and Shadow, there would be no stopping them from awakening Mata Nui now. Retrieving the miniaturized sundial of Mata Nui, Takanuva shone light upon it, instantly locating the hidden entrance to the Codex. As Takanuva gazed at the sky, he noticed Pohatu soaring through the air, but due to his orange armor and altered appearance from the adaptive armor, Takanuva failed to recognize him, and the darker, shadowy part of his nature instinctively pushed him to lash out with shadow. Mistaking Takanuva for Pterodax in disguise, Pohatu prepared to attack this new Toa of Light and Shadow, only for Gali to step in. Bridging her mind with Takanuva's just as she had done when he was merely Takua on the island of Mata Nui, Gali learned of the multiverse of madness Takanuva had just hurtled through, and realized his command over Shadow was the result of Icarax's Shadow Leech attack. Convinced that the armored titan before him was truly Takanuva, Pohatu apologized, and the 3 Toa flew onwards to reconvene with the rest of the Takanuva. Interlude: Destiny War, Part 2. As Takanuva joined the fight in Karda Nui, the rest of the universe was engulfed in turmoil. The war between the Order of Mata Nui and the Brotherhood of Makuta raged on, and no faction or land was left untouched. Across the universe, each major player was embroiled in their own individual conflicts, unaware that their paths were all about to collide. Axon and Brutaka had just tumbled in a pool of antidermis, their fates unknown. Vezon had been captured by Makuta Tridak, just as the fortress was attacked by Mazika and Tobduk in a major diversion in the hopes that Tridak would teleport the vast fortress and what remained of its armies to Metru Nui, where the Order would ambush them with all their forces. On the island of Zia, the Shadowed One, under command of the Order, had seized the populace, preventing them from supporting the Brotherhood, and he had just made a startling discovery of his own on the island. Elsewhere, Prydak, leader of what remained of the Baraki, had discovered a tablet detailing Makuta Pterodax's grand plan, and learned of the intricacies on how to cast the Great Spirit Madanui into slumber with a concoction of special viruses, the viruses that the Shadowed One himself had just stumbled upon. As Kalma, Mantax, and Elek waited to receive word from Prydak on the war efforts, the only other remaining Baraki alive, Takadox, had sailed away, making schemes of his own. In other corners of the universe, the intelligent Rahi Kitongu waged a war against the Visorak Scourge, driving the Makuta servants from their land and freeing their captives. Meanwhile, Toa Helrix watched the war from her inner chambers, observing and plotting. And in the darkness of the pit, Hydraxon and Toa Lezovic finally left to join the Order of Madanui in battle. During all this, a heated battle between the Toa Mari and Toa Haga had broken out, with the Haga resolved to destroy the floor of the Colosseum to root out Makuta Pterodax once and for all. And all this time, the colossal dragon Makuta Mizrix soared in the skies of the universe, searching for Pterodax on his own quest of revenge before being directed to the Colosseum, the same place the Toa Haga hoped to find Pterodax. All across the universe, the Order of Madanui launched surprise attacks on the Brotherhood of Makuta and used their allies to conquer key positions. The Brotherhood was taken unaware and lost their footing in much of the lands, though managed to keep up a resistance effort. As battles raged from Ninra to the southern islands, the Order of Madanui began to claim victory one by one. It was at this time that Toa Helrix began to set her grand plan into motion, fortifying the city of Metronui with large walls and sentinels at every coastline, transforming it into a fortress. Despite the complaints of Turaga, Vakama, and Duma, the fortification continued, and Helrix ordered double agents on stealth to begin leaking rumors that the Great Furnace on Metronui was being converted into producing a virus that could destroy Makuta armor, luring a final battle to Metronui. With the main Makuta fortress on Destral under siege and Makuta Tridax tricked into rushing to teleport their armies to Metronui, the ultimate battle to end the war was about to begin. Back in the city of Metronui, the Toa Mari and Toa Haga were still locked in combat, decimating most of the city in their wake. As their fight brought them to the archives, Kualis activated his mask of Rahi control as a desperate measure, summoning a massive Rahi beast to erupt from the pavement and attack the Toa Mari. Acting fast, Toahali blasted Kualis with a stream of water, which proved to be a fatal error, for the enraged Rahi broke free from Kualis' control, rampaging through the streets of the city. Putting aside their personal feelings in this crisis, the Toa Mari and Haga reluctantly worked together to subdue the beast, teaming up to beat it back to the archives and sealing it deep underground. As the 11 battle-weary Toa stood around the unconscious beast, the Toa Haga had enough time to explain to the Toa Mari what was going on, and what their true mission was. As they detailed the Toanuva's daring battles in the core of the universe to fight for the Great Spirit, the Haga revealed that the true secrets of the cosmos and its workings were somewhere beneath their feet, in a place that no Toa, Matoran, or Turaga had ever been. Right now, they had reason to believe Makuta Pterodax had reached that place, and if they were right, it may have already been too late. And so, after hours of planning and half a day to convince the Turaga to support their endeavor, the Toa Mari and Toa Haga finally worked together to create an entrance to the Colosseum. And as the Haga descended into the darkness, they begged the Toa Mari to stay behind, for they were the last line of defense against Makuta Pterodax, should the Haga fail and Pterodax were to escape. Reluctantly agreeing to sit out the fight below the Colosseum, Jalar and his companions watched Norik lead his team of Toa Haga into the tunnel as the entrance sealed behind them. Just then, a mysterious stranger materialized behind the Toa Mari. Carrying the golden heart of the Visorak, the stranger introduced herself as Jomak, agent of the Order of Madanui, and bid the Toa Mari on a dire mission to summon the Scourge of Spiders to be trapped in their final resting place. This heart of the Visorak had been obtained by the Toanuva for the Scroll of Preparations months ago, and now was the time to use it. Refusing to leave Metronui undefended, Jalar bid Huki and Kongu farewell to guard the city, while he, Holly, and Nuparu ventured to Ardedax to summon the Horde. Meanwhile, Toa Helrix, leader of the Order of Madanui, had chosen that time to take drastic action. Traveling to the island of Ninra, one of the last strongholds of the Makuta, and home to the weapons-crafting Ninra Ghost Matoran, Helrix arrived at the site of a grand struggle between the Brotherhood of Makuta and the Order. The Makuta had kept a strong resistance of Rakshi and Exotoa on Ninra, which had held for most of the war, but after a recent climactic battle, their beach was now littered with dead Rakshi, and the Order had claimed victory. Now, Helrix wandered the sands, occasionally picking up a piece of Rakshi armor, studying it for a moment, and then discarding it. Using the power of her mask of psychometry, Helrix could read the past of an object simply by touching it. Her goal was simple. Since the Rakshi were created using energized protodermis, the Order wished to know every source of that substance used by the Makuta so they could capture or destroy those sources. Without them, no new Rakshi could come into being, and it would be far easier to defeat the Brotherhood by cutting off their source of power, rather than beating them in battle. As a vision flashed before Helrix's eyes, she saw an island directly to their north, and caught a glimpse of the scientist Makuta Chirok standing before a silvery pool, one that had a being emerging from it, made of pure energized protodermis. Focusing on that location, Helrix visualized the path to the final pool, and summoned the intelligent Rahi Kitongu, who had agreed to temporarily break off his efforts to save the victims of the Vizrak long enough to help in the war. In return, Helrix had promised him that the Vizrak would never again be a threat to anyone else, a mission that Jalar and his companions were about to fulfill. Arriving on the mysterious island, Helrix and Kitongu warily ventured forth, seeking the final source of Rakshi. Their destination had first seemed uninhabited, but that illusion didn't last long. Helrix spotted things skulking among the rocks. They weren't Matoran or Rahi, but looked like something in between. Something was very wrong on this island, and the air, ground, and even the inhabitants all felt off, somehow, in a way that made even Kitongu uneasy. There were no buildings on this island, just a large, central cavern entrance that beckoned the two warriors forward. Deep within this cave, Helrix and Kitongu came upon a vast lake of energized protodermis, the largest source in all of existence. Rising from the center was a figure of a living being, a head, 2 arms, and a torso ending in the lake itself. Its features were barely there, and its substance was the silver color of energized protodermis. This was a mysterious protodermis entity who claimed to be a raw force of nature, born of creation and destruction. This entity explained how it had once lived in the core of a planet, until one day a portion of its substance forced its way onto the surface. It did not take long for the inhabitants of that world to discover its power or to begin warring over it. But some of what makes up its form was taken and placed inside the Matoran universe, and so escaped before Cataclysm overtook that world. This was, of course, the events of the Shattering and the Core War for Spherus Magna, spoken for the first time in the Matoran universe. Now, the energized protodermis had taken on a will of its own, experimenting on the island around it, and even allowing others, like the Takanuva, to make use of its power if it found their intentions intriguing enough. As Helrix threatened to destroy the entity of living energized protodermis, it only laughed, bubbling up and threatening to cascade downwards towards the two warriors in a wave. Meanwhile, back on the Makuta fortress on Destral, Tridax rushed out of the prison chamber to investigate Mazika and Tobduk's attack, leaving Vezon to wander free around the fortress himself. Reaching a sub-basement, Vezon encountered a Kanohi Olmec, Mask of Dimensional Gates, in front of a large number of stasis tubes, which to his horror held twisted and dark versions of Takanuva, fully converted to darkness and plucked from the multiverse of madness to serve the Brotherhood in the war. Before Tridax was able to unleash the Shadow Takanuva army on the attackers, Mazika and Tobduk burst in, exposing Tridax's armor to a protosteel-eating virus and incinerating his antidermis cloud with Tobduk's staff, killing the Makuta where he stood. As Tobduk surveyed the Shadow Takanuva army, he ordered Mazika to kill Vezon. But seeing as Vezon did not appear to be allied with the Makuta, Mazika spared his life, allowing Vezon to escape with the Kanohi Olmec to a random destination in the universe. Fleeing through a portal, Vezon left the fortress, and with their duty completed, Tobduk told Mazika where to find the Karda Nui entrance, who left to seek out Voltraz immediately. As the fortress began to crumble from their attack, most of the Shadow Takanuva were crushed by rubble where they lay. But unbeknownst to Tobduk, a few managed to escape, plotting their next moves in service of Pterodax. While all this was happening, back on the island of Zia, Ancient encountered the Shadowed One knelt over a small box of viruses, laughing to himself with a body of a dead Vortex beside him, the crystalline protodermis covering his face. The Shadowed One then explained to Ancient that long ago, a Makuta by the name of Kojal had visited Zia with a stash of viruses, looking to combine them into the ultimate weapon. The official story was that Kojal had succumbed to his own viruses, but secretly, Ancient knew that the Order of Madanui had him killed, but the viruses were never recovered. Trying not to look as worried as he felt, Ancient attempted to convince the Shadowed One to ransom the viruses off or give them to the Order, but the Shadowed One took him by surprise, stating that the viruses were the original mix that Pterodax had used to overthrow the Great Spirit Madanui, and that a secret shared was no longer a secret. In an instant, 2 beams of power lanced out from the Shadowed One's eyes, striking Ancient. The veteran Dark Hunter vanished, disintegrated by the force of the blast, for the Shadowed One was willing to kill even his most trusted advisor to keep this a secret. Weeks later, Prydak conveyed everything he had learned of Pterodax's plan to his fellow Baraki, and so Kalma, Mantax, and Elec traveled to Zia, hoping to strike an alliance with the Shadowed One, who they believed to be in possession of some sort of virus left by Makuta Kojal ages ago. Confronting the Shadowed One, the Baraki stated that if the virus was on Zia, he had it, but only the Baraki had the information on how to use it, gained from Prydak's knowledge of Pterodax's grand plan. And so, the Shadowed One agreed to meet Prydak on neutral ground, in the abandoned land of Karzani, planning for Dark Hunters and Baraki to walk side by side into a new dawn. Meanwhile, back in Metru Nui, the city continued to be fortified for battle. Objecting to the Order's goals to have Metru Nui be Stage 1 for the final battle, Huki and Kongu were swiftly removed by the Order of Madanui, temporarily imprisoned so the Order could continue its work. Unaware of the commotion above, the Toahaga continued to delve deeper into the catacombs beneath the Colosseum, traversing into the inner sanctums of the brain of the robot. Just then, in a crash of tearing metal and dust, Makuta Miserix plunged into the tunnels, teleporting directly beneath the Colosseum and confronting the Toahaga. After briefly discussing their intentions to beat Pterodax in his own lair, the Toahaga agreed to team up with Miserix, despite the protestations of Zaktan's floating head in the fishbowl, whose pleas for the Toahaga to kill Miserix were ignored. After what felt like hours of travel, the tunnel at last came to a stop. It ended in a mid-sized chamber, lined with sophisticated machinery. But that wasn't what captured the attention of the Haga. No, they were focused on the 2 corpses in the room. Above them was a large scroll of text, and Gaki could only make out one phrase, Bara Magna. Scraping off a piece of the armor of the long-dead warriors, the Toa and Miserix were amazed to find that their armor was not made of protodermis, and the warriors sported mostly organic, decayed tissue. Since all things within the Matoran universe were made of protodermis, the mysterious corpses had to be from somewhere else, somewhere older, outside their known world. These were, of course, the bodies of Glatorian warriors who had somehow made it into the brain of the robot during the shattering, but were trapped in the catacombs beneath the robot. And as the Haga, Miserix, and Zaktan ventured forwards, they prepared to confront the darkness of Pterodax. Meanwhile, Jaller, Holly, and Nuparu set foot on the land of Artadax. Placing the heart of the Vizrak in the center of a massive volcano, the Toa Mari prepared to summon the millions of Vizrak from around the universe, trapping them there. Just then, Takadox slunk from the shadows, revealing that he had been following them from some time. Trapping all 3 Toa Mari in his hypnotic sway, Takadox forced them to stand still on the island as the Vizrak approached, stealing their boat and stowing away for further exploits. As the horde of Vizrak approached and the Toa Mari stood helpless on the beach, all seemed lost. But just then, a voice began to rattle through Jaller's mind. Taunting him, he recognized it as the voice of Makuta Pterodax himself, who for reasons unknown, wished for the Toa Mari to be freed of their hypnosis. Laughing at the Toa for making such good statues, Pterodax sent a sharp jolt of pain through Jaller's mind, leaving him with the parting words that it would be a shame if Pterodax didn't have a chance to see Jaller's expression as he found out the truth. As the pain cut through the fog of Takadox's hypnosis, Jaller awoke, and with no time to even try and figure out why Makuta Pterodax had saved them, he quickly shook Holly and Nuparu awake, and as they fled the island, the volcanoes erupted behind them, instantly killing every single Vizrak and decimating one of the most powerful armies of the Makuta, finally completing one of the major tasks on the Scroll of Preparations. Back on the mysterious island of energized protodermis, Toa Helrix and Kitangu prepared to face the wave of the mutagenic material. Just then, a portal opened in front of them, and Vezon rushed out, fleeing from the Destro Makuta fortress's destruction. The mad half-being had opened the portal to a random location, which just so happened to be directly in front of Helrix and Kitangu, just as they fled the wave of protodermis. Charging through Vezon's portal, Helrix redirected its location to Pterodax's lair below the Colosseum, seeking to confront the Dark Lord once and for all. as the portal closed behind them that left only Vezon holding the Olmec to his face as the wave of energized protodermis crashed towards him. Barely having a chance to speak, Vezon cried out as he was transformed by the protodermis, fusing him to the Olmec and granting him the innate ability to open transdimensional gates. In an instant of madness, Vezon hurtled through the multiverse, and portals to other worlds began to rip open all across this universe and beyond. It was at this exact moment that Axon and Brutaka found themselves submerged in the pit of Antidermis. To Axon's horror and surprise, the Antidermis had bonded with Brutaka, who already shared a unique connection to the twisted essence of the Makuta after his time on Voya Nui. Brutaka then began to speak, but in a voice that was not his own. And as Brutaka seized Axon in a grip of iron and burning touch, he used his Olmec to open a portal to the catacombs beneath the Colosseum, and in an instant, Axon and Brutaka materialized before the Toahaga, Makuta Mizrix, and Zaktan, followed directly by the materializing forms of Toa Helrix and Kitongu. There was only the briefest of moments for the stunned warriors to reunite, for all around them, the voice of Makuta Pterodax began to laugh. In an instant, a bolt of lightning arced out, shattering Brutaka's Olmec, for Makuta Pterodax did not want them to be able to escape. At the same moment, a loud hum filled the room, and Zaktan's water tank shattered, leaving the former Paraka leader presumed dead, for he had known too much of Pterodax's plan. The remaining combatants stood and faced the voice of Pterodax, and their own final battle was about to begin. High above the catacombs below the Colosseum, the final battle for the Destiny War had begun. Surrounded by towering walls with weapons mounted on the top of each, Metru Nui was converted to a full-on fortress, weapons belching fire and smoke at the attackers. Ships flying the banner of the Brotherhood of Makuta ringed the island city, while flying Rakshi assaulted from every direction, firing bolts of energy from their staves while others pounded on the walls. In one section, a portion of the wall had already crumbled, and warriors fought in the gap, trying to keep the invaders out. By the time Jalar, Hali, and Nuparu returned, the battle was in full force, and even Huki and Kongu had been freed to defend against the Brotherhood's forces, allowing the Toamari to reunite at last. Inside the Colosseum, Turaga Vakama rushed to a secure room, the chamber in which he housed the legendary Kanohi Vahi, Mask of Time. He was halfway down the stairs when he heard the crash. Racing down, Vakama found a dozen heavily armed Tamatoran scattered like leaves in a windstorm. The door to the chamber had crumpled and rusted with age, and stepping through it was a being Vakama hoped to never see again. A little over 1,000 years ago, when he was still a Toa, Vakama had battled a being called Voparak. Surrounded by a field that aged everything it touched, Voparak now worked for the Dark Hunters and sought one thing in Metru Nui, the thing he now held in his great claw, the Kanohi Mask of Time. Looking back at Vakama with contempt, the Dark Hunter shrugged and left, rapidly aging any Order of Madanui agent who tried to stop him. Resigned to the loss, Turaga Vakama rushed out of the Colosseum, prepared to man the defenses and muster the armies to battle with all the strength he had. And all around him, Jalar watched as his city crumbled under the power of the Brotherhood's forces. In his day as the captain of the Takuro Guard, Jalar had honed his mind with battle strategies, and it was clear that the Order had badly underestimated the ferocity of the Makuta attack. As he watched, the defenders of the wall fell back, and the invaders began pouring through. Metru Nui, the city of legends, was almost lost, and it would take a true miracle for the Brotherhood's forces to be beaten back. Part 7. Mata Nui Rising. As the climactic battle began both above and below the city of Metru Nui, the Takanuva continued on their singular quest to reach the Codex and reawaken Mata Nui once and for all within the swamps of Karda Nui. With Takanuva, Titan Toa of Light and Shadow on their side, the Takanuva prepared for one final battle against the Brotherhood of Makuta's most powerful enforcers. Meanwhile, Icarax, still guarded by Toa Ignika, telepathically sent a message to his Shadow Matoran servant Voltraz to rendezvous in Karda Nui and cause a distraction to allow Icarax to escape. Soaring into Karda Nui, Voltraz arrived in the Skyfighter, unaware he was being tailed by his mortal enemy, Mazika, who had been following him ever since gaining directions from Tobduk and encountering Vezon in Makuta's Destral Fortress. As Mazika moved to intercept Voltraz, he managed to distract the Shadow Matoran from his mission to help Icarax escape. Consumed by rage at the sight of his mortal enemy, Voltraz changed course, making a beeline for Mazika. Just then, a mysterious dimensional gateway opened between them, an after effect of the many portals opened by the crazed Vezon. In an instant, both Mazika and Voltraz were sent careening through the multiverse, hurtling towards another alternate universe, while Vazon disappeared into yet another portal, his newfound powers spiraling out of control. Seeing that his distraction had not come to pass, Makuta Icarax sought to distract Toa Ignika in some other way to be able to free himself. As he taunted the silent warrior, Icarax realized that the Ignika did not know it was designed with a countdown that signaled the time when the mask would absorb all life in the universe. After Icarax informed Ignika that this countdown would end when the Kanohi's coloring changed from its current shade of silver to pure black, Ignika forgot all about his prisoner and sped down into the swamp to warn the Takanuva. Back in the swamps below Karda, Tahu and the others collected their 6 keystones, reading inscriptions detailed on the stones as instructions to unlock the Codex and open the heart of Mata Nui. At this moment, Toa Ignika arrived and told the Toa, using his new knowledge of spoken language, that he was not simply wearing the Mask of Life. He truly was the essence of the Kanohi Ignika and on an unstoppable countdown to destroy the universe. Even beyond that, Takanuva added that should they succeed in awakening Mata Nui, devastating energy storms would decimate the entire region of Karda Nui, leaving only the Codex as a safe space. Refusing to give up, Tahu came up with a daring plan: sneak inside the Codex, use the Mask of Life to awaken Mata Nui, and somehow escape faster than the storms could hit. And with that, the ultimate battle began. Clashing through the sky and spiraling down to the swamp, all 8 Toa fought all 8 Makuta, with Icarax and Mutron joining the fight. Words cannot describe the immense scale of this clash of epic proportions, so I won't even try. As the battle outside the Codex raged on, Tahu slipped away to unlock the force field around it, allowing the Toa to enter the mysterious structure while Takanuva and Toa Ignika kept the Makuta busy. Unbeknownst to them, Makuta Antraz managed to slip in behind them, trailing the Toa as they began to discover the secrets of their origins, the Great Spirit, and the nature of Mata Nui himself. Inside the structure, the Toa found 6 giant lightstones and 6 pathways leading off in different directions. Liwa, Pohatu, and Kopaka then came upon 3 fantastical vehicles, sporting technology the likes of which they had never seen before. Just as Pohatu and Liwa claimed their vehicles, seeing them as the perfect exit from Karda Nui, Antraz rushed in, seizing the final vehicle and blasting out of the Codex, with Liwa and Pohatu in pursuit. As the rest of the combatants made their way into the Codex, Icarax lashed out with shadow energy, threatening to destroy the Codex to stop the Toa from awakening Mata Nui. Takanuva left to try and restore the Shadow Matoran to their original state, while Onua, Gali, Ignika, and Tahu tried to figure out how to awaken Mata Nui. Within the structure, the Takanuva came to a tragic realization. The Codex had been intended for them to shock the Great Spirit awake with their powers, but that would take time. And with the damage Icarax had done to the structure, there was only one way they could awaken Mata Nui: if Toa Ignika sacrificed himself, using the energy of the Mask of Life to power the field himself. Initially lashing out in anger at the suggestion and even attempting to kill Tahu, Toa Ignika only slowed after being reminded of Matoro's sacrifice, and what it truly meant to be a hero, to make the ultimate sacrifice to save the universe. The Makuta were attracted to the noise of cracking metal, and Gorast, Gavla, and Vampra were sent to investigate. Surprised to find Icarax destroying the Codex, the Makuta and Shadow Matoran began to attack him for deviating from Pterodax's grand plan to allow the Toa to awaken Mata Nui. As this epic battle of Makuta versus Makuta commenced, another skirmish erupted in the skies. Liwa and Pohatu used their battle vehicles to chase Antraz, while Kopaka flew after them, looking to regain control of his vessel. In a swift attack, they expelled Antraz from his craft, sending him hurtling to the ground while Kopaka seized control of his ship. Back in the battle with Gorast, Vampra, and Icarax, Antraz and Mutron quickly joined the fight to preserve Pterodax's will, and in a brutal attack, they blasted Icarax apart mid-teleport, sending each of his atoms scattered across the universe and killing the so-called leader of the Brotherhood once and for all. In the skies above Karda Nui, Takanuva encountered the scientific assistant Vikon, who told him of the clock Rahi and the curative powers of its sonic scream. Rounding up as many Shadow Matoran as he could capture, Takanuva brought the Av Matoran to the recently captured Clack, where they began to slowly be cured of their shadow. Just in time for a cured Shadow Matoran to explain that the Makuta actually wanted the Toa to win and awaken Mata Nui for reasons unknown. Rushing to warn his friends, Takanuva made a beeline for the Codex, unaware that Makuta Krika had overheard his revelations about the energy storms, and began to slowly piece together the true depth of Pterodax's plan. As Takanuva hurtled downwards to the swamps, he was attacked by Chirox and Biddle, using his power of light to rend holes in their armor and force their antidermis essence out. Giving in to his battle rage and shadow side, Takanuva fired devastating blasts of shadow from every limb, tearing the Shadow Matoran from the backs of the Makuta and focusing his power on burning the Makuta within. As Kopaka caught the Matoran as they fell, he managed to calm down Takanuva, bringing everyone back inside the Codex to discuss the plan to reawaken Matanui. Despite Takanuva's warnings that the Makuta wanted this to happen, the Toanuva felt that there was no other way to achieve their destiny. And so, loading into the vehicles and gathering as many Matoran as they could, the Toanuva prepared to leave Karda Nui, just as Toa Ignika hurtled towards the Lightstones to reawaken Matanui. As the Toanuva fled the Codex, Makuta Krika caught up to his fellow Makuta, desperate to save his companions. Despite not agreeing with Pterodax's mission, Krika still felt respect and camaraderie with his fellow Makuta, and felt compelled to warn them of their fate. For if Pterodax truly wished for the Toanuva to reawaken Matanui, then he knew the energy storms Takanuva spoke of would materialize before them, ripping the Makuta apart. In his horror, Krika realized that all 8 of the strongest lieutenants for Pterodax had been sent to a suicide mission as the pieces of Pterodax's plan fell into place. Catching up to the fanatical Gorast first, Krika begged her to listen to reason and help him convince the Makuta to abandon Karda Nui and save themselves. But seeing Krika as a deterrent to Pterodax's grand plan, Gorast activated her mask power, making Krika lose control of his power of intangibility, ripping apart his body from within. And just like that, Makuta Krika died, failing to save the universe, warn the Toa, or even save his companions, at the hands of which he had just been killed. Inside the Codex, Toa Ignika began the process to sacrifice himself, channeling energy into the Great Spirit. At this very instant, in the lair beneath the Colosseum, Makuta Pterodax was taunting those who tried to stop him, immediately sensing the power of the Ignika fueling the body of the Great Spirit once more. As Makuta Miserix lashed out at the machinery in vain, he was restrained by Axon, Brutaka, and Helrix, who realized he was damaging the very mind of the Great Spirit itself. Only chuckling, Makuta Pterodax cast Miserix into a powerful illusion, transforming the enraged dragon into a painting of himself. In the same instant, Makuta Pterodax cast the Toahaga into a powerful illusion, one where the battle was over, Pterodax had been defeated, and there would only be peace and happiness wherever they looked. As the Toahaga happily sauntered out of the chamber, Pterodax then turned his attention to the remaining foes, teleporting Brutaka, Axon, and Kitongu out of existence to the far southern reaches of the universe. And now, all that was left was Toa Helrix. Taunting the first Toa, Pterodax promised to keep her imprisoned for all eternity in the mind of the Great Spirit, sharing his plans, dreams, hopes, and ambitions with her, for as long as she remained sane. Anyone else would have been filled with dread at Pterodax's words, but not Helrix. Instead, she saw an opportunity. She would be alive, her memories would be her own, and she would be in the center of Pterodax's thoughts. Right then, she made a vow. She would not break. She would not crumble before the weight of his darkness. No matter what, she would defy him, and somehow find a way to help others do the same. As Helrix promised Pterodax that this wasn't over, Toa Ignika committed the ultimate sacrifice in the heart of Karda Nui, kickstarting the heart of the Great Spirit robot. Only Gali noticed a flash of darkness slip through the cracks between the Kanohi Ignika, and there was little time to ponder that, as the energy storms began to restart all around Karda Nui. Realizing that Pterodax had betrayed them, the remaining members of the Brotherhood of Makuta tried fruitlessly to escape, save Gorast, who was stunned and driven mad by this treachery. And so, each Makuta was disintegrated, one by one, with Pterodax's main competition all taken out, leaving him the sole living Makuta in the universe. Climbing onto their vehicles, the Toanuva soared out of Karda Nui, passing the clack creature which cured Takanuva just as the dome was enveloped by light, for the Great Spirit Matanui had awoken again! Meanwhile, back in the grand city of Metronui, the battle continued to rage on. Just then, all around the combatants, everything began to change. The stars brightened overhead, the breeze turned warm, the earth shook in a gentle tremor. Somehow, all the warriors were certain, the Great Spirit had awakened. Beyond the city walls, a storm rose, tossing the Makuta fleet about like toys. Yet that did nothing to deter the Rakshi, who kept on coming. They had broken through the walls in 4 places, rampaging through Ta Metru. Just then, Vakama and Jaller put a daring plan into motion. Hailing Krakua, Toa of Sonics, they convinced him to cycle through a series of sonic frequencies before he found just the right one to awaken the Borak that had been stored in the archives below Metru Nui. And so, the ground itself erupted before the Rakshi, and hundreds of Borak poured out with a singular mission to reach and cleanse the island of Mata Nui. As the Rakshi attacked the Borak, the city slowly shook from a series of explosions, and a cry echoed from the highest towers of Kometru. There were fighter vehicles inbound. Holly looked up to see 3 incredibly fast aircraft soar over the city, bank as one, and head back to where the ships waited. One slowed and dipped its wing to her, and she recognized Pohatu in the pilot's seat. The Takanuva had come home. Peppering the Rakshi with blasts of light from their vehicles and decimating what remained of the Brotherhood ships, the Takanuva and Takanuva had arrived to turn the tide, and finally, the storm was over. The Brotherhood ships had sunk to the bottom of the Silver Sea, and while the walls around the city had been battered down, the rubble was littered with dead Karda and shattered Rakshi armor. Metru Nui was safe, and as the Takanuva confirmed, the Great Spirit had awakened. The power of the Brotherhood of Makuta was broken for all time. Taragaduma and Taragavakama appeared side by side to announce that tomorrow would be a citywide day of celebration in the Colosseum. Only Toa Holly stood aside. Despite all the wounded and dying among the defenders, she could not help but feel it had all been a little too easy. True, there had been some unexpected help. The airships, the Borak, the storm. But they had faced an army of Rakshi. Something told her they should not have won, at least not with so much of the city still intact. And as she returned to aid to the wounded and shook off these troubling thoughts, she failed to hear the sound of dark laughter on the wind. Outside of the Matoran universe, beneath the endless ocean, in the heart of a massive cave, energy pulses coursed through rock. Machines which sat immobile for 1,000 centuries shuddered and slowly moved, shaking the universe. Power raced through long disused conduits and streamed further and further from Karda Nui. Water rippled around the barren island of Mata Nui, stripped of all life and vegetation by Borak hordes. Powerful quakes shook the earth, and massive megaliths of mountain and bedrock crashed into the ocean. An immense chasm ripped upward through the middle of the doomed island, each side sliding toward the ocean as something massive pushed up from below. Far away, to the south and east and west, water foamed and boiled as underwater shockwaves spread from the movement beneath the sea. Gigantic whirlpools formed and disappeared. The sea itself heaved up towards the sky. 2 halves of the island churned, already frothing waters as they slid apart and dissolved into the maelstrom. A tremendous head made of metallic protodermis rose from beneath the shattered remains of the once beautiful island. Water, soil, and rock cascaded off its face as it rose higher and higher into the sky. Titanic shoulders breached the ocean, and an equally immense chest pivoted upwards. Slowly, the robot climbed to its feet and towered above the clouds for the first time in 100,000 years. Yellow light gleamed from its eyes as it surveyed the ocean below. Mata Nui has risen. Colossal eyes flashed for the briefest of moments before turning dark. Within the Grand Colosseum of Metru Nui, Taragaduma gave a thrilling speech praising the exploits of the Takanuva in their efforts to reawaken Mata Nui. As he proclaimed that the age of darkness was over and they could finally live in the light, his words were cut off by a fleeting shadow that passed over the twin moons, and an ice-cold breeze cut through the Colosseum. High above, the stars of Metru Nui were darting across the sky, spinning wildly. It looked as if the universe itself was being undone and remade at the same time. Slowly, the stars began to realign, coming to rest in a pattern both bizarre and horribly familiar. From random stars in the sky, they had arranged themselves into a shape, the shape of the Mask of Shadows, symbol of Makuta Pterodax. As Kopaka slowly began to realize why Makuta Pterodax wanted them to reawaken Mata Nui, a dark, humorless laugh boomed from every stone, every star, from the ground, the sky, the ocean. Matoran huddled in fear even as the Toa drew their weapons. As Tahu yelled into the sky, promising to fight back against the Makuta, Pterodax only continued to laugh, explaining that when the Takanuva awakened Mana Nui, the antidermis spirit of Makuta Pterodax had been in the brain of the robot already, and managed to slip in and take the place of Mana Nui's spirit. And so, the Takanuva had awakened Mana Nui's body, with Makuta Pterodax's spirit taking his place. And to the Toa and assembled crowd, the voice of Pterodax chuckled. How could they fight the air they breathed, the ground they walked on? For Pterodax was no longer a physical opponent. To the denizens of the Matoran universe, he was their god. Omnipotent and all-powerful, the only threat to Pterodax now was the spirit of Mana Nui himself. And as the great spirit robot's eyes turned red, the ground beneath the Toa's feet shook violently as a surge of energy flowed through all existence. Outside the robot, the mask of life was ejected from the Matoran universe, carrying the life force and spirit of Mana Nui. And as the Matoran, Toa, and the Order of Mana Nui prepared for an eternity of misery under this reign of shadows, their only hope now was the spirit of Mana Nui. Somewhere in the endless void between planets, the mask of life flew. Free of the bounds of the Matoran universe, it had turned from silver back to gold once more. It carried within it the mind and spirit of Mana Nui, on a journey whose destination no one could know. But if anyone were able to hear the being within the mask, one statement would have been clear, ringing through the void like the tolling of a bell. I will return. But that wraps up the longest and most complex chapter of Bionicle Retold, Chapter 8, The Ignition Trilogy, Part 3, Rising. Stay tuned for in 2 weeks, we'll be posting the penultimate chapter of this saga, Chapter 9, Rebirth.
Alright, and with that, we have summed up this colossal chapter of Bionicle Retold. I really hope you enjoy, and again, in 2 weeks, definitely stay tuned for the thrilling next chapter of the story. Now, there's a ton of stuff that we got throughout this chapter, so if you're confused or really just want to review certain parts, of course I have the table of contents down there as usual, broken up into chapters. If you want to take a look back and see just the adventures of, say, a certain set of characters, you could really just follow it that way. And I hope that at least this makes things a little bit more clear, especially when you try to tackle the 2008 Bionicle storyline, which just has so many disparate story threads and different plots weaving in and out of each other, all culminating in the climactic final battles. And so, this is where we're going to leave Bionicle Retold. I hope you enjoyed this retelling, and let me know down in the comments below again. If you have any questions, comments, concerns whatsoever, let me know, and stay tuned for in 2 weeks, we'll be posting the next chapter of Bionicle Retold. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you again very soon, and bye-bye for now.